Chapter 674. After Noyce brought the various drugs, Dean checked them and carefully adjusted the dosage. If the dosage was too small, it would be difficult to have an effect. If the dosage was too large, he was afraid that he would directly inject the extremely weak female pioneer to death. To be on the safe side, he first concocted a medium dosage and injected it into her. Then, he observed the changes in her body's vital signs. Soon, he saw that her heartbeat suddenly sped up, thumping madly, then quickly weakened, followed by rapid heartbeat. This was an abnormal reaction after the drug took effect. It would greatly consume the user's lifespan, but at the same time, it would bring an unparalleled pleasure. Dean picked up the cold water and poured it on the female scavenger's face. Water splashed everywhere, jolting Eleanor out of her stupor. She hurriedly looked up, and her pupils constricted in shock. Apart from the young man in front of her, the ground beneath his feet was completely dyed red. Limbs covered in black carapace were scattered all over the place. They looked extremely familiar. She looked down and was stunned. Her arms were gone, and the lower part of her body below the knees was also gone. Only her naked torso was left. No. She was horrified. It was difficult for her to accept this fact. She never thought that the handsome teenager in front of her would be so cruel and merciless. She thought that at most he would use drugs or equipment to lock her up and imprison her. She didn't expect him to do it so thoroughly and directly abolish her body. Her heart was full of regret. If she had known this earlier, she would have risked her life to kill the teenager. At least she could have perished together with him. Dean looked at her quietly, watching her face change from shock to remorse and undisguised murderous intent. He said in an indifferent tone of admiration, "You have changed your mentality quite fast. You deserve to be a pioneer. If you were an ordinary person, you would have fainted or burst into tears and collapsed completely." Eleanor clenched her teeth and stared at Dean angrily. She wanted to eat him with her eyes. "You will not have a good death." "What a simple curse," Dean said indifferently. Dudian indifferently said, "Your mistake is that you despise me too much. If you had a bit of backbone then at least you could have died, but now it's too late." Eleanor was angry, but she was an experienced pioneer after all. She didn't let her anger get to her head. She said, "You want to get information from me? Don't even think about it. I won't tell you. Even if I tell you, aren't you afraid that I'll tell you false information? I advise you to let me go. I have no ill intentions towards you. If you go too far, I will definitely bring you destruction." "Is this a threat or a plea?" Dean stared at her. "Even if I let you go, you won't live. Don't you know that you have been infected with a highly toxic poison?" Eleanor was stunned for a moment before she sneered. "Don't try to scare me," Dudian said in a cold voice. "Did you forget that Her Highness Aisha bit your body?" Eleanor was shocked and her face suddenly changed. She suddenly remembered that the demonized body in her abdomen had been bitten by Aisha. She didn't think about it because she was captured and trapped. Now that Dean mentioned it, her whole body suddenly broke into cold sweat. Aisha's form was clearly in the state of zombification. Although the teenager didn't admit it, but she wouldn't question her judgment. In other words, she was very likely to be infected with ptomaine. Moreover, it was a super strong ptomaine that could infect Aisha. "It's over." Her heart was cold, and her eyes were full of despair. Dean's heart sank when he saw the despair in her eyes. He said it mainly to see her reaction. From her current reaction, it was obvious that in her cognition, being infected with ptomaine meant the worst situation. Moreover, there was no hope. Even when she saw her limbs cut off, she didn't despair like this. Could it be that after being infected by ptomaine, there was no way to reverse the situation? Humans had been fighting with the undeads outside the giant wall for hundreds of years. Couldn't they develop a drug to remove ptomaine infection? He clenched his fists, and his heart was full of anger. He didn't believe it. He suddenly thought that maybe this woman's status was not high enough, So even if she knew the existence of the drug, she couldn't get it, so she was desperate. It was also possible that her status was too low, so she didn't know the top secrets. Yes, it must be so, Dean thought in his heart. His heart that was cold and about to go crazy suddenly grasped a life-saving straw. He took a deep breath, stared at the female pioneer coldly, and said, "Do you think you still have hope to live?" Eleanor looked at the air in front of her in despair. Her mind was completely blank, and she couldn't hear what Dean said. Only endless fear echoed in her mind. She never thought that her life would suddenly come to an end. What kind of feeling was this? She thought that she still had a lot of things to do, and a lot of good days that she hadn't enjoyed. Suddenly, a little light appeared in her despairing eyes. Seeing the sudden burst of light, Dean's heart beat fiercely, but the next moment he was hit by Eleanor's question. "How long have I been in a coma? How long has it been since I was caught by you?" She looked at Dean impatiently, and her eyes were full of expectation. Looking at such a pair of eyes full of hope, Dean's mood became cold. There was a trace of death in his eyes, and he said expressionlessly, "It has been about half an hour since the infection. With your physique, you should be able to hold on for an hour. You still have half an hour left to think. Think with human thinking. Do you have any last words?" Hearing Dean's words, Eleanor's heart suddenly became cold, as if it was stuck by ice. Her whole body was cold. She was stunned for a moment and then smiled bitterly. "If I knew this, I would have killed you. I would have dared to fight with you. As long as you can tell me your identity and the information behind you, I can let you go immediately." Dean still held a glimmer of hope, and quietly looked at her. Eleanor smiled and looked at him mockingly. "Don't even think about getting any information. I'm hopeless. I will wait for you in hell. I will always look up at you, and when you fall, I will pull you into the endless abyss." Her voice was full of resentment, but there was a desperate smile on her face. Noyce, who was watching from the side, shuddered. Dean's heart sank. This answer made him angry. He suddenly grabbed her throat and said, "You are too low, really too low. You are just a soldier sent to investigate the situation. What pioneer? Garbage. You are a pile of garbage. Why didn't they send a smarter person over? Why didn't they send a stronger person?" Eleanor grinned, and suddenly her teeth became extremely sharp. She bit the back of Dean's hand with her protruding fangs, and tore off a piece of skin. She chewed 2 mouthfuls, spat it to the side, and laughed out loud. "Now you're also finished. Haha, smelly brat, who asked you to be so proud and arrogant? Now you're also infected." Noyce looked at the bloody back of Dean's hand. "Master, are you okay?" Dean looked at her hysterical laughter. The anger on his face slowly calmed down. After she finished laughing, he slowly said, "Do you really think so?" Eleanor looked at Dean's calm expression. The smile on her face disappeared, but then she thought that it might be Dean's forced calmness. However, she soon noticed that Dean's heartbeat was still flat. There were no fluctuations. In other words, there wasn't even a trace of tension in his heart. This was absolutely impossible. No matter how shrewd a person was, he wouldn't be so calm when he knew that he was going to die. Thinking of this, she suddenly thought of a possibility, and her eyes once again burst forth with new hope. Could it be that she wasn't infected? Dean coldly said, as he saw the change in her expression, "I forgot to tell you that I have the antidote for undead infection." "What?" Eleanor exclaimed in shock, her face filled with disbelief. But soon, she thought of Aisha, who had turned into an undead but wouldn't attack the boy. This situation was really strange. She was sure that Aisha had turned into an undead. The faint rotten smell she smelled before was clearly locked on when she saw Aisha. This smell came from her body. This was the smell of an undead that she was very familiar with. However, Aisha was very different from the undead in her impression. Although Aisha's fighting style was similar to that of an undead, but she would not attack other people. Such a phenomenon was simply impossible, but it really existed. Thinking of this, she looked at the faint mockery in Dean's eyes, and her heart suddenly believed a little. Although the probability was very low, maybe this boy really had such a magical medicine in his hands. Chapter 675. Eleanor stared at Dudian. "What information do you want?" "Everything," Dudian replied. "You can start from your identity and the people behind you." Eleanor was silent. She had to betray Hathaway in order to survive or stubbornly resist to the end. However, once she died, there would be nothing left. She was not a professionally trained warrior of sacrifice, nor was she a believer whose thoughts were completely dominated. To her, life was more important than anything else. However, she wasn't willing to obediently allow this despicable young man to dig out information from her body just like that. "Will you let me go if I tell you?" She stared at Dudian's eyes. Dudian indifferently replied, "Of course I'm a man of my words." Eleanor was silent for a moment. "My name is Eleanor. I'm from the military headquarters. Of course I'm from the inner wall. The military headquarters in the inner wall is different from the outer wall. The military headquarters here can only be regarded as a small part of the military headquarters in the inner wall. It's like the soldiers stationed in the land of exile. The military sent me to check the situation of the outer wall. His Majesty Aristotle has been angered by the fact that you have ruled the outer wall. Although the abandoned land is dirty, but it's still His Majesty's territory. He won't allow others to plunder it." Dudian narrowed his eyes. It wasn't the first time he heard the name Aristotle. The last time he heard it was from Gwyneth. Aristotle was the person who ruled the entire giant wall. He was the one who stood at the top and knew the most secret. He had expected that the fall of the outer wall would inevitably lead to a counterattack from the military. That's why he didn't care when he seized the military. After all, it was a step that he had to take sooner or later. "How is the strength of the military in the inner wall?" Dudian looked at her and asked. Eleanor replied, "Which aspect are you referring to? As far as I know, there are about 300,000 soldiers in the regular army and 100,000 in the reserve army. The general physique of the soldiers is higher than that of the outer wall. Although the ordinary soldiers haven't integrated with the magic marks, but they have gone through professional training. Their physique is strong and they are only slightly weaker than primary hunters with magic marks. Some of the soldiers in the Ace Corps have superb fighting skills. They can even kill primary hunters in a head-on confrontation. You won't have any room to resist if the army attacks you." Dean pondered. Although he expected that the inner wall would be very strong, but he was quite surprised to see the strength of the military at the grassroots level. However, this world wasn't the same as the world of World War II. The magic marks were like a bug in the system. The key to dominate the battlefield was the number of soldiers at the grassroots level. "How many pioneers are there?" he asked. Eleanor guessed Dudian's thoughts. "There are 10 pioneers. They are known as the 10 military gods. They are invincible." "What about you?" Dudian looked at her. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had actually forgotten about her. She calmly said, "I can only be regarded as a substitute. I have just been promoted to a pioneer. There are 13 to 15 people like me in the military." Lin Luoran gave an approximate number, which sounded more real. As for other information about the military, she did not fabricate. But she was not sure how many pioneers were hidden in the military. At least, she was sure that there were more powerful pioneers in the military besides the 10 gods of army that were known to the public. Dudian nodded slightly. He knew that she shouldn't be lying. "What is the level above the pioneers?" he asked. He was more curious about this question. When he was recuperating in the wasteland, he also asked Aisha. But she didn't say much. "I don't know. As far as I know, the pioneers are already the strongest existence, but there are strong and weak pioneers. Aisha belongs to the top of the pioneers. She has the blood of the witches. She has awakened it 3 times. She is far better than the ordinary pioneers. Moreover, she has the legendary dragon magic mark, which is ranked in the top 3. Eleanor thought for a moment and said, "Maybe your Majesty knows." At the same time, her mood was a bit heavier. Dean would ask her so obviously that Aisha, as she had judged, was really a corpse. Otherwise, such a question could be asked directly to Aisha. She knew much more than herself. Dudien's eyes flashed. The worries in his heart were slightly relieved. After all, the strongest existence he could deal with at present seemed to be the pioneers. If there was a more terrible power above the pioneers, then he would have no chance of winning. He could only hide his strength and bide his time. He had to build a power field in the outer wall to have a chance of fighting with them. "Tell me about the monastery," he said. Eleanor said, "I don't know much about the monastery. As far as I know, there are only 6 pioneers. They are the 6 guardians of the monastery. But I estimate that the monastery has at least 10 pioneers. Their dean is unfathomable. He should belong to the top of the pioneers. He is even stronger than Her Highness Aisha." "Isn't the monastery under the command of His Majesty?" Dudien looked at her. This information was provided by Gwyneth. The monastery and the military were the 2 major institutions under His Majesty Aristotle. One was the force and the other was the faith. Both of them ruled the entire giant wall. Eleanor said, "Yes, but although they are also His Majesty's people, the monastery and the military have little interaction. So we don't know much about them. We don't dare to inquire about them." Dudien nodded. This was a good explanation. He said, "Then tell me about the Dragon Clan and the other 2 witch families that you are loyal to." Eleanor was stunned and asked, "What did you say? I didn't hurt your ears. You should be able to hear me clearly." Of course, Eleanor could hear him clearly. But she was a bit shocked. So Dudien already knew her identity? How did he know? Did Aisha tell her about it? But she obviously couldn't speak. "Your battle armor told me." Dudien didn't pretend to be profound. "This is the first lie. I didn't point it out at the beginning because I didn't want you to be vigilant. At least in this way, the information you provided to the military and the monastery would be roughly accurate. Now you can continue. Also, I don't like to listen to stories. I hope you know what's good for you." "Armor?" Eleanor woke up and was shocked. The armor that she was wearing was something that the pioneers of her family would wear outside the giant wall. How did this boy know about it? Haley didn't tell her that Dudien had been to the wasteland. After all, Dudien was just a nobody. She only needed to know whether he was alive or not. However, her negligence caused Eleanor to suffer a huge loss at this moment. "You have 5 minutes." Dudien looked at the clock on the wall and reminded Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the clock. Her face was slightly pale. She said to Dudien, "Didn't you say that there are 30 minutes left? Only 5 minutes have passed." "Because my medicine can only treat you now. The longer the time, the deeper the infection will be. At that time, even if you retain your consciousness, I can't do anything," Dudien said seriously. Of course, he couldn't tell her that he had another purpose for the remaining 20 minutes. Eleanor's face changed. She hesitated for a moment and immediately said, "I'll tell you what you want to know. I'll tell you everything. Ask quickly." "Dragon's mother has awakened her bloodline. How many times has she awakened her bloodline?" Dudien asked. Eleanor hurriedly said, "I don't know. I really don't know. Dragon's mother hasn't made a move for many years. But I know that she had made a move 12 years ago. Although I don't know if she had used her full strength, but the power that erupted at that time had reached the 4th degree of awakening." 4th degree of awakening? Dudien narrowed his eyes. Haley had also awakened her bloodline for the 4th time. But Dragon's mother was the manager of the dragon family. Her power should be more than that. "I want to know about Haley's situation," Dudien said immediately. Eleanor knew that even if she told him, he would die. She would go back and ask Haley for forgiveness. At least she wouldn't die. Thinking of this, she quickly told Dudian some basic information about Haley. In the blink of an eye, 5 minutes had passed. The holy son of Wing family is as strong as Her Highness Aisha. It is said that he has awakened his bloodline for the 3rd time. Eleanor was still talking. She didn't waste time to fabricate a lie when it came to the information about Wing family and Rock family. Anyway, these 2 families were also enemies of the Dragon family. It was not a big deal to sell them out to Dudian. Okay. Dudian interrupted her and got up. It's almost time to treat you. Chapter 676. Dean came in front of Eleanor. He raised his hand and touched her smooth face. He whispered, "Remember your words. Look up to me in hell." Eleanor was startled. Whoosh. Dean suddenly grabbed her eyes with his 2 fingers like hooks. 2 blood-stained eyeballs were pulled out. Puff, puff. 2 blood-stained eyeballs were pulled out. Eleanor screamed. Although her body was anesthetized, but the anesthesia in her brain was slowly fading. Dean's actions were very rough. Even a strong-willed person couldn't bear the pain. When she opened her mouth to scream, Dean threw her eyeball into her mouth, and then forcefully covered her mouth. His calm face was full of murderous and ferocious. "Since you have eyes but can't see, why do you need this pair of eyes?" Eleanor screamed as blood oozed out from the gaps of Dean's fingers. Dean turned to Noyce. "Go get a big bag. I'm going to transport her to the inner wall." Noyce was startled for a moment before he reacted. He hurriedly turned around and ran away, but he felt like vomiting. He almost escaped from the purgatory shrine. Dudian loosened his hand. Eleanor screamed in grief and indignation. She spat out 2 blood-red beads. They were her eyeballs. She no longer held any hope for the youth. She was angry, resentful, and regretful. The youth was so cruel and inhumane. Not only did he break his promise, but he also didn't show any mercy. If she knew this, then she wouldn't have any hope. Her hope turned into the most thorough despair. "I won't let you go even if I turn into an undead. I'll kill you. Her Highness Haley will avenge me. She will kill you." Eleanor roared in grief and indignation. Her face was completely distorted by the indescribable resentment. She stretched her neck forward. As long as she touched Dean's body, she would bite him. Otherwise, there would be no way to vent her anger. Dean quietly looked at her. "You have also killed people. In that case, you should be prepared to be killed, just like me. Shameless villain. Despicable and filthy commoner, I'm going to eat your flesh and chew your bones to pieces." Eleanor screamed in anger. Pain and despair made her want to break the shackles and destroy everything. However, her body was fixed by the chains and didn't loosen because of her anger. Dean pulled out a washcloth from the side and stuffed it into her mouth. Eleanor was so angry that she bit the washcloth and spat it out. She continued to curse. "You refuse a toast only to drink a forfeit." Dudian coldly snorted as he pulled out a sword and stabbed it into her mouth. Eleanor let out a blood-curdling scream as she held the sword in her mouth, not daring to bite it. Dean stirred a few times and pulled back the sword. He took a rag from the table and stuffed it into her mouth. Eleanor screamed in pain as she bit the rag in her mouth, but she couldn't spit it out. Her tongue had been twisted off, and she couldn't use it to force it out. At this time, Noyce returned to the temple with a huge bag in his hand. Dean picked up Eleanor and threw her into the bag. He looked at Noyce. "Clean up this place and don't cause panic. I'll be back soon." "Yes, master." Noyce suppressed the fear in his heart and replied. Dean carried Eleanor on his back and jumped off the cliff. He quickly climbed down the cliff towards the direction of the inner wall. He kept Eleanor's life mainly because he didn't want to waste resources. Anyway, he was ready to start the plan to deal with the inner wall. She was just a vanguard. He silently calculated the time in his mind after leaving the mountain. He hoped to reach the inner wall before she turned into a zombie. Dudian walked all the way on the official road. His speed was extremely fast, like chasing the wind and chasing the shadow. Occasionally he would encounter carriages along the way. He was as fast as a breeze. 15 minutes later, Dean finally arrived at the Wall of Sighs. At this time, he felt that Eleanor's struggle was gradually weakening. He knew that she was very close to turning into a zombie. He immediately ran along the Wall of Sighs to the side of the giant wall. He looked up and saw some red dots on the top of the side of the wall. They were the soldiers stationed in the inner wall. He didn't want to alert the enemy, so he immediately took off the backpack on his back and held it in his arms. At the same time, he held his breath and fully stimulated the power of the magic mark in his body. 2 bulges slowly bulged out of the clothes on his back. They were 2 translucent wings. Although his wings had been forcibly pulled out last time, the genes in his body were still there. The stem cells in his body followed the original shape of the genes and could still reconstruct his wings. However, this was similar to the self-healing of human wound. The recovery speed was extremely slow, and it could not be treated by external forces. He could only rely on the energy accumulated in his body to repair it. Even now, his wings had not completely recovered to their original state. Whoosh! Dean's body slowly rose into the air. Although it was a broken wing, he was barely able to fly. He slapped the smooth giant wall with one palm, and with the help of the rough surface left behind by the dust of time, he quickly climbed up the giant wall. Dudian lowered his body and ran towards the inner wall area after reaching the giant wall. The soldiers stationed on the side of the wall were sitting in groups of 2 or 3. They seemed to be chatting and having fun. They didn't pay much attention to the surrounding surveillance. Dean smoothly passed through the side of the wall and continued to run for thousands of meters. Then he quickly descended from the giant wall. When he landed on the grass, he found that Eleanor had stopped moving. Knowing that it was time, he continued to rush forward. The soil of the inner wall was 4 times more than that of the outer wall. The outer wall only occupied 1/5 of the entire area of the giant wall. Dean carried Eleanor all the way. After walking for 4 or 5 minutes, he suddenly heard a roar and a violent struggle. He was very familiar with this roar. It was the same roar that came from Aisha's mouth. It was like a wild monster. Dean's eyes were gloomy as he continued to move forward. Suddenly, a sharp object poked at the edge of the luggage and hit the armor in his arms. He was shocked and hurriedly threw away the bag. He looked down and saw that there was a scratch on the armor. But it didn't hurt the skin. He was relieved. The arm that was bitten was his left hand. It could stop the spread of the poison. But the rest of the body couldn't. Once bitten, he would die. At that moment, the bag that he had tossed out rolled violently on the grass. Suddenly, the bag burst open, and a few strange limbs wriggled out from within. Then, a figure slowly stood up, or rather, crawled up like a spider. The only difference was that its torso was Eleanor's. Dean saw Eleanor's ferocious face. He immediately noticed that her pupils weren't black like Aisha's, but green like the other undeads. Chapter 677. Roar. Eleanor, who was lying on the ground, growled. Her delicate face was extremely ferocious. Her mouth was split to her ears by her fangs, and saliva was dripping from her fangs. She stared at Dean. Dean didn't have time to think. He immediately turned around and ran. He didn't expect that Eleanor was completely different from when Aisha was infected. Her injuries were completely healed under the influence of the virus. Moreover, the shape of her body was different from when the magic marks were stimulated. But there was no doubt that her combat power was not weak. Whoosh! When Dean turned to run away, Eleanor desperately chased after him. Her speed was surprisingly fast. Dean was shocked. He hurriedly urged his wings and flapped them to rush forward. At the same time, he slowly lifted off the ground and flapped his wings in midair. But this time, he didn't use his palms to borrow strength from the giant wall. Relying only on the 2 wings to fly, not only was the speed slow, but it was also extremely difficult to fly. He swayed in midair, rising and falling, and it was very difficult for him to control it. Although he could control the wings as freely as his own hands, it was completely different to use the wings to control the wind. The holes on the wings were blown by the wind. Occasionally, a breeze would blow on his face, making him feel like he was about to be overturned. Roar! Eleanor roared and quickly chased after him on the ground. The mutated limbs under her abdomen crawled crazily, trampling on the grass and leaving several inches deep marks. Dean hurriedly raised his altitude. He didn't expect that this person would have such a strong power after turning into a corpse. He thought that he would be in a weak stage like Aisha, and would need some time to slowly recover, but it was obviously not the case at present. Roar! Eleanor's neck was raised 90 degrees to look up at Dean in midair. Her whole face was ferocious. The strange limbs under her abdomen crawled quickly to catch up with her. At the same time, she grabbed the sand and soil on the ground and threw them at Dean. Dean hurriedly dodged, but her throwing strength was extremely fast. The sand and stones shuttled back and forth like sharp arrows. Although he tried to dodge, his wings were still hit by several stones. His body suddenly lost balance and fell. His face changed. Once he fell, he would have no chance of winning with Eleanor's current strength. He hurriedly tried to control the wings. After falling more than 30 meters, he finally stabilized his body and continued to flap his wings to fly up. Roar! Eleanor roared and jumped from the ground to more than 80 meters high. But Dean was more than 100 meters high, so he couldn't catch her. Dean secretly complained in his heart as he heard the angry roar behind him. In the blink of an eye, he had fallen to the point where he had to escape from her hands. Roar! Suddenly, an excited roar rang out. It roared and charged towards the other direction on its left. Dean looked back and saw Eleanor rushing to the left side of the grass. From the sky, he could see a 10-meter-long black-patterned python crawling in the grass. Eleanor instantly appeared in front of the black-patterned python. Her ferocious and beautiful face widened as she hugged the black-patterned python and started biting it. Sensing danger, the python coiled its head like a bow and was about to strike, but it was smashed by Eleanor's monstrous limbs the next moment. The python's head was smashed into smithereens, and its brains splattered all over the surrounding grass. Dean seized the opportunity and quickly ran forward. In the blink of an eye, Eleanor disappeared without a trace. It didn't take long for him to return to the giant wall. He climbed up the wall and reached the top of the giant wall. He didn't think that he would be saved by a python. Fortunately, the python had led her away. Otherwise, it would be hard to guarantee that he wouldn't lose his life if she continued to chase him. He walked along the giant wall and rested as he recovered his physical strength. He immediately rushed back to Utopia Mountain. Although the plan to dispose of Eleanor's body didn't go smoothly, but at least she was sent to the inner wall. Although she was in the wilderness of the inner wall, but the military was stationed here. Sooner or later she would be found and cause a disaster if she wandered around. It's a pity that she was turned into a corpse when she was sent to the city. Dean secretly regretted in his heart. Barton was relieved to see Dean return safely. "Master, are you okay?" Dean shook his head. "I made you worry. Have you found any witnesses of the previous battle? This news must be blocked. If any rumors spread out, then say that it was the attack of the Dark Believers." "I know, Master." Dean patted his shoulder and quickly returned to the temple. He saw Aisha sitting quietly on the chair. Her posture was the same as when he left. Dean's heart finally settled down. "Master, the temple has been cleaned up." Noyce respectfully bowed. "Do you have any other orders?" Dean looked at him. "Come over." Noyce's heart tightened, but he still came forward. "Do you think that woman should be killed?" Dean calmly stared at him. Noyce lowered his head. "Young master, that woman offended you. Of course she deserves to die." "I saw that you didn't have the heart to cut off her body," Dean said. "Do you think that I'm too cruel and inhumane?" Noyce's heart was pounding in fear. He bent down. "Master, I didn't think so. Dean lifted Noyce's arm. Jean, we have been in the same prison. I hope you can understand me. Noyce was startled. Dean hadn't called him that for a long time. It's normal that you can't bear it. I don't blame you. Dean calmly said. Everyone will feel unbearable and cruel when they see some bloody pictures or things that go beyond their bottom line. But this feeling is temporary. It's like a person who hears that someone is starving to death. He won't be touched much. At most, he will have a trace of sympathy. But if he sees a person starving to death with his own eyes, his sympathy will be expanded to the extent that it's enough to influence him. He will help him and give him materials. Noyce bowed his head. It's the same as starving to death, but you look at it in a different way. The feeling you get is also different. Just like when someone hears the smell of blood, they can only imagine some bloody pictures, but they can't smell the disgusting smell of blood. So, you feel that you can't bear it because you are there, and your senses are stimulated so your heart can't bear it. Dean instilled in him, as if he was telling some kind of truth. Noyce's thoughts were chaotic, but he knew what Dean meant. People are emotional. Emotions are an uncertain factor. Since it's uncertain, then, it can't be used as a rational judgment. Dean quietly looked at him. I hope you can understand me. There are too many things that I have to do in this position. I have to be cruel. If I was weak and didn't notice her, then we would be dead. Noyce was silent. He knew that Dean wasn't lying. He couldn't help but feel guilty for his previous thoughts. Master, I understand you. I don't dare to have messy thoughts. I thought that you were too cruel, but now I think about it. Who hasn't committed a crime? She deserves to die. No. Dean denied his words. The previous thing was indeed cruel. Cruelty is cruelty. There's no need to cover it up. I won't cover up my own ugliness because of the ugliness of others. But I have to do it. Even if it's cruel, it's only right. Noyce understood and felt an indescribable sense of respect in his heart. He nodded. Young master, I understand. I'll engrave these words in my heart. All right. Dean nodded. He was relieved as he saw Noyce eliminate the grudge. He didn't want to see the people around him betray him like sham. Grudge was the first step of betrayal. That's why he said so much to Noyce. I didn't expect the Dragon Clan to attack us. It's either the military or the monastery that informed the Dragon Clan. Dean whispered to himself. The reason why they told the Dragon Clan is because they know that I have a grudge against Haley? Or did their spies recognize Aisha? From the looks of it now, Hathaway should already know of my existence. He felt a bit tricky. The perfect arrangement in his plan was to deal with the military and the monastery first, and then find the Dragon Clan for revenge. After all, there were many masters in the Dragon Clan. He needed to accumulate strength through the war between the military and the monastery. Only then would he have the ability to step into the Dragon Clan and take revenge. For example, we can create some chaos in the inner wall so that the Dragon Clan and the military won't be able to divert their attention to the outer wall. In this way, the incoming enemies can be regarded as bubbles. Noyce was excited and curious. Master, are we going to create chaos in the inner wall? Can we do it? If you want to, you can do it, Dean said. Go and call Glenn and Gwyneth. In addition, tell Sergei to call Sword King and Hawkeye from the Dark Church. He had to advance the plan now that the Dragon Clan was involved. He had to use this strategy to delay the time. Moreover, he could take advantage of the situation to enhance his strength. Yes. Noyce nodded and left quickly. After a moment, Noyce brought all the people named by Dudian to the hall. After entering the Divine Hall, the Sword King and Hawkeye could not help but look around. They felt shocked, as well as an indescribable strange feeling. Once upon a time, this Divine Hall was a place they dreamed of invading, but they never thought that one day they would be able to walk in through the main entrance. It felt really strange. Dean looked at Sword King and Hawkeye. Elders, I remember that there are several ranking lists in the outer wall. I hope that both of you can find the top 20 assassins in the ranking list. I need them to go to the inner wall to do something for me. If they are willing to participate, then you can fulfill one wish of each of them, as long as it is within the scope of your ability. Sword King and Hawkeye were stunned. They didn't expect Dean to look for them in such an urgent manner. Go to the inner wall to do something? Or 20 people together? Was it that easy to go to the inner wall? The two of them were stunned for a moment. They wanted to ask, but they held back. I know, Chairman. Hawkeye took the lead. He was familiar with Dean, so he knew that Dean didn't say anything. Go. Dean waved his hand. Be sure to find them before 7 o'clock. Yes. Sword King bowed. Dean looked at Glenn after both of them left. You will lead the mission. There must be no mistakes. Yes, young master. Glenn accepted the order. Dean looked at Gwyneth. Your mission is to go outside the giant wall. I have rented a passage at 2 o'clock on the right side of the 2 o'clock direction. There is a monster there. I have imprisoned it using the tungsten steel cage that I have forged. Go and check its condition. If the cage is broken, then it means that the monster has run away. If the cage is missing, then it means that the monster is still nearby. Come back and report to me as soon as you find it. Gwyneth was startled. She thought of the huge tungsten steel cage that Dean had forged. Her face changed. How big would the monster be if it was imprisoned in that cage? I know, master. She hesitated for a moment but agreed. She felt that Dean didn't let her go to the inner wall. Chapter 679. I know. I'll do my best to complete the task, Glenn said. She didn't have a good impression of the inner wall. She wouldn't have the slightest sympathy even if a lot of people died. I've marked the places with red circles on the map. These are the places where the poison must be placed. If anyone doesn't place the poison, then they will be executed, Dudian said in a cold voice. In addition, you have to guard against any of them taking the opportunity to sneak into the inner wall. You have to get hold of their weakness. Yes, master. Glenn nodded. I'll give the poison to Noyce. Gather the people and come back to collect it. Yes. Dudian came to another hall after Glenn left. It was the place where the scriptures of the Holy Church were stored. Now the scriptures had been emptied and various experimental tools had been set up. It was Dudian's alchemy room. Dean took Aisha to the side hall and asked Noyce to wait outside. He went to a cabinet and opened it with a key hidden in another cabinet. He took out a head. It was the head of the Corpse King that bit Aisha. Dean put on gloves and held the Corpse King's head in front of a bubbling water tank. He slowly put the head into the water and soon it sank. At the same time, the color of the water in the tank changed. A trace of black liquid overflowed from the Corpse King's mouth. It mixed with the water and dyed it red. This time he didn't use the fierce poisons made by the potioneers but corpse poison. His purpose wasn't to kill but to create chaos. The Corpse King's virus was the most suitable. Dean asked Noyce to give her the refined corpse poison. The corpse poison was put into a water bag. He said again, "Be careful. I've prepared some gold for you. If necessary, you can buy others to do things for you. But remember not to leak any information." I know, Glenn solemnly replied. Noyce looked at Dudian after Glenn left. Master, can they put all the poison into the cities of the inner wall? Aren't the defenses of the cities very tight? Dudian replied. As long as they have the intention to break the law, then they won't do anything else. Death is enough. Noyce was silent. As long as they have the courage to poison the public wells that are commonly used by the residents. Many people don't do it because they don't have the ability, but they don't have the courage. They are afraid of being traced back to them, Dudian said. Noyce listened and nodded. That was true. The first task of the military will be to stabilize the chaos in the inner wall. They won't be able to allocate too many people to manage us. Moreover, if the chaos expands, then even the devil families will be forced by Aristotle to suppress the chaos, Dudian said. Noyce understood that Dudian was using offense as defense. He couldn't help but admire in his heart. Dudien was the only one who could calculate the inner wall in such a way. Heroes are born in troubled times. If there are no troubled times, then create troubled times. Dudien's eyes narrowed. We have to seize the opportunity to accumulate strength as soon as possible to deal with the coming war. Yes, master. Dudien calculated the time. It was time to let the barbarians enter the inner wall. It would be a waste of manpower if they didn't use them. Call Sergei to call Richelieu and Barton, Dudien said to Noyce. Noyce left. The civilians living in the commercial district were living a peaceful life. Noble ladies and young masters were drinking afternoon tea. They were talking about the taste of desserts and the beauty of the Moulin Rouge. Farm owners were also conscientiously spurring their serfs to plant food diligently. In the mines owned by the nobles, the foreman was whipping the miners to make them work harder to mine. Some rich businessmen and consortiums were secretly inquiring about the movements of the military and the Holy Church. They wanted to know some inside information and to see the current situation of the outer wall. However, the news from the Holy Church and the military made the entire outer wall burst into an uproar. The military and the Holy Church issued an announcement at the same time. They decided to cancel the registration of the poor. They would become ordinary civilians with relative freedom. They wouldn't be slaves and would be exempted from slavery. Moreover, they would enjoy the legal protection of the magistrate. The entire outer wall was turned upside down as soon as the news came out. The people who were the most excited were the poor people in the slums. To them, the reformation of the Vatican and the army was like a blessing from the heavens. It had completely changed their lives. They didn't even dare to dream of such a thing, but it had happened in reality. The nobles and civilians in the commercial district had the most intense reaction. All of them were opposed to the reform. For the nobles it meant that they would lose the cheap labor force of the poor. They would have to pay the price of the civilians if they wanted to hire workers in the future. This was tantamount to losing a lot of money for no reason. For the commoners it was the same. If the poor became commoners, then they would have fewer opportunities to work and more competitiveness. Correspondingly, their wages would inevitably be reduced. This was inevitable. Moreover, the existence of the poor had made them feel a sense of superiority. They couldn't tolerate the filthy smell of the poor to become the same as them. It didn't take long for a group to come to the front of the military and the Holy Church when the news came out. They held signs and strongly opposed the reform. The scene was chaotic. Dean didn't care when Noyce passed the news back to him. He had considered the two major obstacles when he introduced the policy. To put it bluntly, it was tantamount to fighting against all the people in the outer wall. It was as difficult as a leader of a country to implement a policy that was opposed by the whole country. After all, 95% of the wealth of the entire outer wall was in the hands of nobles and civilians. The poor had almost no savings except to fill their stomachs. After all, the poor had always been a cheap labor force. Some of them were even treated as slaves. It was good enough that they could eat their fill. There was no such thing as a salary. Most people knew that some black-hearted nobles would abduct and sell poor people as laborers, but they all tacitly agreed to it. Because there were no poor people in the upper echelons of power, no one would cry out for such a group of people. But now Dean had done it. Of course he wouldn't go against the nobles and civilians. He wouldn't be able to suppress the riots no matter how much force he had. "Master, do you want me to send people to drive them away?" Noyce carefully asked. Dean waved his hand. "Don't worry about them. They are just pawns. The people behind them are waiting to catch us. We can't intensify the contradictions. Let Barton release the news that he will give everyone a reasonable explanation. Let them digest and adapt to this matter." Noyce couldn't help but ask, "What if someone makes trouble today?" "Let the Dark Church deal with it. They won't appear today," Dean calmly replied. Noyce understood and immediately retreated. Dean dipped the pen in the ink after Noyce left. He was ready to write a speech. The title of the speech was, Everyone is equal. At the same time, the outside world was in an uproar because of this sudden policy, and it was in an uproar. Chapter 680. Master, 3 bishops have come over. They want me to abolish the cancellation of the census of the poor. Barton came to the temple and said to Dudian. Dudian asked as he ate, "What do you think?" Barton was startled. "I think Master should have other purposes. But in my opinion we have to appease them as soon as possible. Otherwise the outer wall will be in chaos. You know the life of the poor better than anyone else. Don't you want it to come true?" Dudian didn't raise his head. Barton smiled bitterly and said, "Of course, I hope that the poor will no longer be oppressed. But to be honest, it's not worth it to offend others for the sake of these poor people. Even if all the poor people are grateful to us for this, it's just gratitude to us. However, the nobles and commoners control land, farms, and other high-end resources. If they resist, it's really a bit dangerous." "Did the 3 bishops tell you these words?" Dudian casually asked. Barton blushed a little. "They said some things. I think they're right." "I think so too." Dudian put down the chopsticks and looked at him. "You see, even you aren't willing to help these people. Who is willing to help them? It's because no one has changed the status quo that such a deformed situation has always existed. The sentence that exists is reasonable. Do you think that the 3 bishops are right if you go back to the slums to continue living?" Barton was stunned. After a while, he said hesitantly, "But, to us, the nobles haven't jumped but the bishops are jumping. They usually talk about benevolence but at the critical time they are the first to stand up and oppose benevolence." Dudian said in a cold voice, "If anyone from the Holy Church tries to persuade you again then deal with them immediately." Seeing that he was angry, Barton lowered his head and said, "I understand." Noyce saw that Dudian's anger had subsided. "Master, don't be angry. The people in the Holy Church are upright and upright. They spread the faith of God and love all living beings. But you know that they are just fooling the civilians. No one will hesitate to expose their ugly faces when it comes to the rice bowl in their hand." Dudian said in a cold voice, "That's why we need to rectify them." Noyce was puzzled. Dudian continued, "Why did the monastery establish the Holy Church and the Dark Church? The purpose is to do bad things and the other to do good things. The thief will catch the thief. If the Radiant Church became like the cult of shadows, then what was the point of its existence? There are already enough people who do bad things for us, but the number of people who do good things for us is growing fewer and fewer. If this continues, what prestige will the Radiant Church have? Is there any need for it to exist?" Noyce was ashamed in his heart. He admired Dean's vision. The reason why the people trust the church is because of the followers of darkness. Some of the knights in the church killed their enemies bravely and used their blood and sacrifice to gain the trust of the people. If one day the people believed that the Radiant Church and the cult of shadows were no different from each other, that they were all vampires, then how would they be managed? Just force and deterrence? Dean snorted. Richelieu failed because he managed the Dark Church and the Holy Church at the same time for a long time. He mixed up the 2 places and made the white one muddy and the black one not black enough. That's why both swords became incomplete. That's why he failed. Why don't the nobles or the military believe in the God of Light? It's because they have been in contact with the God of Light for a long time. They know that they are fighting for their own interests. That's why they don't believe in the God of Light. Dean continued, "If the Holy Church was pure then there wouldn't be the military and the magistrate in the outer wall. Unfortunately, Richelieu didn't make good use of these 2 swords. He only knew how to use the followers of darkness to boost the strength of the Holy Church. But he didn't know that corruption would breed within a strong enough force. And some people with good eyesight can see the rot at a glance, so they won't believe it. It's like if you see a rotten apple, would you still eat it? You won't." Noyce nodded. "Master, I've learned a lot." Dean finished the food on the plate. He poured a small glass of white wine from the white porcelain bottle and drank it. There was a trace of warmth in his stomach. The coldness in his body and his left hand dissipated a lot. His mood became slightly better. The white wine was brewed by him. It was the only one in the outer wall. It wasn't sold to the public. Other people liked to drink red wine. The pungent smell of white wine was unbearable. But Dean liked to drink it. However, he didn't dare to drink too much. He needed to keep a clear mind. He would drink until the coldness in his body subsided a little. Dean was in the room looking at the superchip. He was absorbing knowledge from it. Aisha was by his side. She didn't make any sound. She sat quietly like a virtuous wife. Dean was tired. He looked back at her and felt that his fatigue had faded a lot. At the same time, the bustling commercial district outside of Utopia Mountain was brightly lit. People were coming and going in the densely populated commercial district. The relaxed and lively nightlife had begun. Carriages with noble flags were going in and out of some high-end places. Some of the heads of the noble families were frowning. It was difficult for them to fall asleep. The night was over and the dawn was coming. Amidst all kinds of anxiety, anger, unwillingness, and other emotions, the nobles in the business district received today's morning newspapers from the church and the military ministry. The contents of the headlines were almost the same. Everyone was dumbfounded when they saw the contents of the scroll. If yesterday's news about the cancellation of the census of the poor was a bomb, then today's news was equivalent to a thunder. First of all, the Holy Church and the military confirmed that the plan to cancel the census of the poor would remain unchanged. All the poor could apply to leave the slums and live in the civilian area. But they would have to follow the rules of the civilian area. They would have to pay basic taxes. They couldn't sleep on the street. They had to sleep in their houses. All the poor who entered the civilian area could apply to the military for a house and job opportunities. But they would have to pay monthly rent and payroll taxes to the military in addition to the series of policies for the slums. The real thunder was the news for the nobles and civilians. First of all civilians would have the opportunity to apply to become a noble. They only needed to meet the corresponding conditions to change their census. Chapter 681. Civilians and nobles who read the newspaper couldn't believe their eyes. In their minds, the hierarchy system was sacred and couldn't be broken. But now, all the commoners had the chance to become the high and mighty nobles. To them, this was something they didn't even dare to dream about. Among them, the ones who were the most excited were the wealthy merchants. Most of them were commoners. Although they were smart and had businesses all over the world, they had a lot of money and weren't inferior to some of the ancient noble families. However, no matter how much money they had, in the eyes of the nobles, they were still just country bumpkins. This kind of contempt wasn't just a matter of face. In some high-end banquets, even if they got an invitation card, they would be excluded at the edge. No one would pay attention to them, and they wouldn't be able to expand their network. Even if they knew that they weren't nobles, they would directly refuse them. This kind of contempt was reflected in all aspects. This was both the advantage and disadvantage of the hierarchical system. The people who stood at the top could enjoy the best treatment, while the people who stood at the bottom had to face the most difficult situation. Now there was such an opportunity for those who were eager to become nobles. It was worth it no matter what price they had to pay. The same mentality also existed in the hearts of the nobles. The status of the inner wall in the hearts of the nobles was like that of the nobles in the hearts of the civilians. It was unattainable and unreachable. It was obvious that they could see it, but they couldn't reach it. It seemed that it was always the best and the most desired thing. The news spread like a hurricane throughout the outer wall. It was even faster than the news of the barbarian invasion. Child, you have to learn well. Sit, walk, stand, and run. You have to have a good temperament and style. Follow what the teacher has taught you. You can't act recklessly. In a courtyard in the civilian district, a mother with khaki hair was teaching her child. The child, who was only 5 or 6 years old, was dressed cleanly and meticulously. His khaki hair was neatly combed, and he was wearing a small suit with a red tie around his neck. He looked like he had a high status. The child walked in the courtyard and asked, "Mom, why do I have to practice this? Lily has gone to school. I want to go too." "Silly child, what's so good about studying in the Carpenter Academy? In the future, when she comes out, she'll only be able to do the work of a commoner. You're different from them. If you practice these noble etiquette, one day you'll become a noble," Mother said with a smile. "Mom, can I become a noble just by practicing this?" the child asked, puzzled. His mother smiled and said, "Your grandmother used to be married to a noble. Later, because of some things, she moved out of the commercial district. In our generation, she is already a commoner. But one day we will go back. When you finish practicing, we can go back." "I know, Mom. I will practice hard." The nobles in the commercial district received the news one after another. The head of the Glow family, who was in charge of the Green Consortium, looked at the newspaper in his hand. He was shocked for a few minutes before he recovered. His eyes were red and filled with tears. He was so excited that his voice trembled. I finally have the opportunity to return to the inner wall. We can finally return to the inner wall." Similar voices resounded in many aristocratic castles. Early in the morning, all aristocratic castles were filled with cries. At the same time, in the central zone of the inner wall, there was a meeting hall in the main courtyard of the monastery. The old man who was sitting at the head of the table looked at Morgan. "How is it? Did the dragon clan send people to the outer wall? Why is there no movement?" Maglo respectfully replied, "Dean, according to the people I bribed, the Saintess Haley has sent someone to the outer wall. However, the person I sent to the outer wall to observe the boy is still alive. I guess that the Dragon Clan isn't sure if the information is true or false. They only sent one person to investigate. I think the information has been passed back to the Dragon Clan. If the person beside the boy is indeed the Saintess Haley, then I think the Dragon Clan will make a big move soon." "Really? Why is there no movement in the outer wall?" The burly old man frowned. "Who is the person that the Dragon Clan sent to the outer wall to investigate? There shouldn't be many masters in the Dragon Clan who can investigate Aisha." Maglo shook his head. "This subordinate doesn't know. But they should send a master. I remember that the person who is ranked 3rd on the assassination list is from the Dragon Clan. If he is sent, then he will be able to investigate the true identity of the woman beside the boy." The burly old man nodded. "It seems that we need to wait for another day or two. Let your people pay close attention to the changes in the outer wall. What is the response from the military?" "The military guys have the same idea as us. They also intend to let the Dragon Clan take the lead and test the truth. They don't want to send the 10 military gods to fight against Aisha. It is said that the woman has awakened the power of the devil bloodline. Her strength is extraordinary. Ordinary pioneers can't deal with her. Even if the 10 military gods were to go, there would be a lot of casualties," Maglo said. The burly old man nodded slightly. Suddenly, his eyes flickered as he asked, "Do the winged race and the rock race know about this?" Maglo understood the meaning of the burly old man. This subordinate has secretly disclosed it to them. "I think they are also watching the actions of the Dragon Clan. They even sent people to the outer wall to investigate. It is a good opportunity to get rid of the Dragon Clan's Saintess. They should be tempted." The burly old man whispered, "This is a good opportunity to see the performance of the 3 major devil families." "Oh yes, has His Majesty returned?" "Not yet." Maglo shook his head. The burly old man nodded but didn't say anything. At the same time, in a city of the inner wall, Glen was dressed like a noble lady. She was accompanied by 2 attendants. She was holding a white puppy in her hand. She was strolling in the streets. There were soldiers in armor stationed here, but there weren't many of them. Glen inadvertently glanced at them. She saw the situation of the defense. She handed the puppy to one of the attendants. The attendant's palms were rough and there was a scar on his hand. He wasn't an ordinary attendant. Glenn came to a place where no one was. She used the power of magic marks to dive into the earth. Not long after, she arrived at the underground area where the soldiers were stationed. Soon, she saw a huge well that led deep underground. According to the markings on the map, this well was the city's largest water source, and it was connected to an underground reservoir. Glenn dived into the well, unscrewed the lid of the glass bottle in her arms, and threw it into the well along with the bottle. Chapter 682. Barton, call the wall builders to come over and rebuild the temple. Dean handed over the new drawings to Barton. This project is classified as top secret. Don't leak it out. Give priority to the supply of materials. The construction must be completed as soon as possible. Dean was aware of the negligence of the temple when Eleanor sneaked in yesterday. Although he had arranged cables and other defensive equipment under the temple, but the depth was not enough. Moreover, a person who was good at burrowing would not only lurk 10 meters under the temple. As a result, the power system would be useless. Barton took the drawings and immediately thought of the person who attacked yesterday. He turned and left. Noise came in from outside. Master, the alchemists that you asked the council to transfer have arrived. Yes. Dean nodded. Has the sacrificial hall on the west side of the square been vacated? It has been vacated. Noyce answered. According to your orders, there are all kinds of experimental equipment. They are of the highest grade. Well, let them go. Give them the information and let them produce as soon as possible. Dean pulled out a stack of information from under the 2 books on the desk and handed it to him. It was about the assembly materials of various parts of the biological sensor. Now he only needed to be at the helm. There were many things that he didn't need to do personally. For example, the smelting of these parts could be handed over to the alchemist. After all, they were people who had been studying science and technology for decades. In some aspects, even Dean couldn't compare to them. It was the most suitable for them to be his assistants. He was even prepared to hand over some of the divine arts he could produce to the group of masters in the shrine for them to help him produce. Dean started to think about the next invention. Now that the war was coming, he had to produce several inventions that would help him the most in the limited time. I can replace the virus for biochemical weapons. I can only rely on electricity for individual weapons. I can improve the artillery of the military. I can't make missiles with the current equipment. The purification technology of the raw materials isn't up to standard. After thinking about it for a while, he finally stopped the idea of continuing to expand the new magic. Instead of making a lot of weapons, it was better to make the best use of what he currently had in his hand. He immediately wrote down the detailed drawings of solar power according to the knowledge in the superchip. It would be amazing if we can make laser weapons, Dudian thought in his heart. But he knew that it was just a dream. With the current level of technology, they couldn't even make missiles, let alone laser weapons. Dudian asked as Noyce came back. What is the situation of the military? Have the people from the slums migrated to the civilian areas? Reporting to young master, the military sent a letter this morning saying that the civilian area is almost full. After the people in the slums received permission, almost all of them lined up to move to the civilian area. The military is really worried about this matter. What's there to worry about? Dean disagreed. As long as the civilian area meets the conditions, they can migrate to the commercial district. Wouldn't that make more space? Noyce lowered his head. Young master, you don't know, but there have been a lot of friction when the slums have migrated to the civilian area. The military has sent most of the troops to maintain and suppress the situation. But there are too many of them. Doesn't Richelieu know how to limit the number of people? Only 30,000 or 50,000 people are allowed to migrate every day. The military has hundreds of thousands of troops. Can't they take care of tens of thousands of people? Duddian raised his eyebrows. Noyce patted his head. Young man, you are smart. But how can Sir Richelieu not think of such a simple method? It's not that he doesn't want to, but he doesn't dare to. Duddian dipped the quill in the ink. Tell him to be bold. As long as it's not against my will, then it's fine. I know. Noyce understood. At this time Barton came in from outside. Master, your student Edward wants to see you. He wants to ask you a question. Duddian thought for a moment and guessed what the student wanted to ask. Let him go to the sacrificial hall. Also tell him that he can freely go in and out of there. Yes, young master. Barton left the temple and came outside. Edward, who had been waiting for a long time, came up to greet him. Your Majesty the Pope, is the teacher willing to see me? Barton said, Your teacher said that you should go to the sacrificial temple. As far as I know, there are a lot of people with extraordinary knowledge there. They might be able to answer your questions. Your teacher also said that you should follow them and learn well. Edward was startled. Thank you, Your Majesty the Pope. Go ahead, Barton said with a smile. Half an hour later Duddian finished the drawing of solar power. He stretched his body and his bones made cracking sounds. He looked out of the window at the direction of the sighing wall. Glenn hadn't come back yet. He didn't know how she was doing. His eyes flashed as he called Noyce. Let's go out and take a look at the situation outside. Yes, young master. The carriage was ready. Duddian took Aisha's hand and let Noyce drive the carriage away from Utopia Mountain. They went around the commercial district. Inner wall, Dragon Clan's Saintus Peak. Hathaway was sitting on the throne with a dragon's head carved on the armrest. She looked at a youth in front of her. Eleanor hasn't come back yet? How long has she been in the outer wall? Why would it take so long to investigate a little kid? The youth replied in panic. Your Majesty, please spare my life. This isn't my business. Humph. Hathaway was about to open her mouth when a figure entered the hall. It was the middle-aged man. His face was as white as a corpse. There was a faint smile on his face. He looked at Hathaway. Your Majesty doesn't need to ask. Eleanor hasn't come back yet. It means that the person in the outer wall is Her Majesty Aisha. Hathaway coldly looked at him. Why do you think so? Eleanor is ranked 12th on the assassin list. She isn't going to assassinate but to survey the situation. With her skills, she can find what she wants in 5 hours at most, even if the target is Aisha. She isn't a fool. She won't wait for an indefinite period of time. A good assassin knows how to create opportunities for herself. The middle-aged man continued. It's been half a day but she hasn't sent back any news. It's basically certain that she is dead. Even if she isn't dead, she would be captured. Hathaway narrowed her eyes. Cold light flashed in her eyes. Of course she had expected this possibility. She suppressed her voice and said, Eleanor knows the severity of the situation. I have told her that the target might be Aisha. She won't expose herself so easily. She won't be caught even if she can't investigate the situation. The middle-aged man shook his head. Your Majesty, there is an old saying that one who survives a disaster is bound to have good fortune later on. Her Majesty Aisha didn't die in the tide of corpses. According to my guess, she broke through the limit and forced out her potential. Her bloodline awakened for the 4th time. Hathaway's pupils shrank as she stood up from the throne in horror. Impossible! Nothing is impossible. The middle-aged man calmly said. The awakening of bloodline power is unstable. There is a greater chance of awakening when the emotions fluctuate to the extreme. The family has already calculated the awakening of bloodline power in the past. Her Majesty Aisha was forced into a desperate situation in the tide of corpses. It's understandable that she awakened her bloodline power and escaped. Otherwise, the probability of her survival would be too low unless there was a master helping her. But there was only one boy at the scene. That boy is just a waste. How could he help her? Hathaway's face turned ugly. She didn't want to admit it, and she didn't want to believe it, but she knew that it was indeed possible. Fourth awakening. Damn it! She clenched her fists as her beautiful face was full of anger and resentment. She awakened her bloodline at the age of 19. She awakened faster than the genius dragon mother. She must die. The middle-aged man said, if she awakened her bloodline and got some other unknown special ability, then it's understandable that she wanted to kill Eleanor. Anyway, it's 80% certain that this person is Her Majesty Aisha. We must attack as soon as possible. We can't give her any more time to grow. Moreover, we must kill her in one fell swoop. The ferocious expression on Hathaway's face gradually turned gloomy as she said, I don't need you to tell me that. She was able to survive even though she was already in a situation of certain death. This time, I'm going to completely crush any chance of her surviving. Her Majesty is wise. In the divine hall of the Dragon Clan, on a large, scarlet bed that was 3 to 4 meters wide, a voluptuous young woman lay quietly. Her skin was smooth and tender, and she wore a bright red robe. It was not the color of blood, but a scarlet red that was as exuberant as flames. The skirt under her robe covered the entire bed, causing her figure to seem especially petite and exquisite, incomparably beautiful. I heard that Hathaway has been paying attention to the outer wall recently? The beautiful woman whispered. The old woman respectfully replied, Miss, Her Majesty Hathaway has secretly sent a maid to the outer wall. I don't know what she wants to do. I've heard that the monastery and the military have been paying close attention to the outer wall recently. Is there anything worth paying attention to in this small, abandoned land? Dragon Mother's voice was soft. It was as pure and elegant as warm water. The old woman whispered, Miss, should I send someone to the outer wall to have a look? Dragon Mother nodded. How is the selection of the saintess? Miss, we haven't found anyone who can reach the level of Her Highness Aisha's bloodline purity. The old woman whispered, We have only found one who is barely close to Her Highness Hathaway. But the child's talent is good. She is a bit stronger than Her Highness Hathaway. Maybe she will be able to make up for her shortcomings in the future. Dragon Mother's gentle eyes turned indifferent. She slowly said, Little Aisha's talent is the best in the history of our dragon clan. It's a pity that I couldn't protect her. I'm guilty. The old woman hurriedly looked up. Miss, you can't say that. No one wants to see Her Highness Aisha's accident. Blame Miss Hathaway for making trouble. She was ruthless enough to take her sister's life. I didn't discipline her well. Dragon Mother shook her head. Originally our dragon clan had hoped to break the wall. But now we can only wait. The wrinkles on the old woman's face drooped as she deeply sighed. The sun slowly swayed across the sky as the night gradually fell. Lights lit up in various cities one after another, lighting up the dark night. Almost all the houses in the cities were lit up with lights. In some families, the housewives carried the vegetables and meat they had chosen to the well in the yard, put down the bucket, shook a bucket of water from the well, and began to clean the vegetables. After washing them, they returned home, cut the bread that had been prepared beforehand, and put the fresh vegetables on it. While the wife was preparing dinner, the husband also got off work from the factory. After a busy day, he was so tired that he didn't want to talk much. When he got home, he lay on the sofa. After resting for a while, he grabbed the newspaper on the sofa and started reading. This was the only entertainment he had every day. The child who finished his homework was starving. He was waiting at the table. The wife prepared the dinner one after another. She lit the oil lamp on the table. The dim light of the candle shone on the faces of the family of 3. They looked happy and harmonious. They clasped their hands together and recited the prayers from the monastery. Then they started to eat dinner. Compared to the simple dinners of ordinary families, the nobles' dinners were much more extravagant. In the resplendent and luxurious dining hall, crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, illuminating the dining hall as if it were daytime. Red wine and delicious food were served by the servants. When the dinner started, The servant massaged the master and the dog came to the dining hall to eat. The servants were busy attending to them, serving them wine and passing them cup. The dog lay at the feet of the master and rubbed its head against the thigh of the master. This was a skill that they had mastered. As long as the master was comfortable, then they would get food as a reward. Soon, the well-dressed lady's thighs became numb and comfortable. She smiled and used a knife to cut off the untouched steak on the plate. She cut out a piece and put it on the plate. Then, she bent down and handed it to the human slave dog at her feet. The human slave dog stuck out its tongue and shook its head to express its joy. In the hands of the nobles, being a dog was no less difficult than being a servant. First, it had to go through professional training to master the behavior and language of the dog. It also had to forget its original language. As a human slave dog, no matter what happened, it was not allowed to speak. Gulp. The human slave dog bit the steak on the plate and quickly swallowed it. Then, it expressed its gratitude and joy. It rolled on the carpet at the side and shook its head. Chapter 683. Cough. Cough. Suddenly, the young man who had just finished eating the steak lay on the ground and coughed violently. He clutched his throat with both hands as if he was trying to spit out something stuck in his throat. When the noblewoman saw this, she rolled her eyes at him and said, "You're such a good-for-nothing. You can choke just by eating something." The dog was still coughing violently. His face turned red and he raised his hand to cover his mouth. The aristocrat frowned and said, "Get out of here. Go to the torture room and get 20 lashes." After that, she kicked him with her embroidered boot. The dog didn't seem to hear it. He coughed louder and louder. Gradually, he spat out some liquid from the gap between his fingers, which fell on the carpet. The lady thought it was saliva. She became more and more disgusted and kicked him. The young man suddenly stopped coughing and quietly lay on the ground. The lady became more and more annoyed. She kicked his shoulder and neck with the sharp part of her boot. She didn't care that it was a weak point of the human body. She kicked him and said angrily, "I told you to get out of here. Did you hear me? Did you hear me?" With a thud, her sharp and long high-heeled boots kicked into the young man's neck. When she withdrew her foot, she saw a bloody hole in his neck, but strangely, there was no blood gushing out from it. When the lady saw this, she quickly raised her foot that was about to land, and stepped on the young man's shoulder. "You almost dirted my carpet, you bastard!" The young man's neck twitched slightly. The joints inside seemed to be hardened. It was extremely difficult to move. When he turned his head and looked up at the lady was stunned. She saw that the young man's face was covered with blood. It seemed that he coughed out from his mouth. His hand covered his mouth, causing the blood to splash on her face. At first glance, he looked like a beast that had just bitten a living creature. "You roar!" The young man suddenly screamed and rushed to the lady. The lady screamed in fear and shouted for help. The surrounding attendants jumped in fright and quickly pulled out their weapons to help. At this time, a little girl sitting at the end of the table, after a violent cough, suddenly rushed to her brother. For a moment the entire restaurant was in chaos. This chaos extended out from the aristocratic castle like moonlight. Horrified screams and sparks filled the entire castle. On the patrol road in the castle manor, it was already a scene of battle. People, wearing the same armor, pounced on the people around them with ferocious expressions. On the streets outside the castle walls, it was also incomparably chaotic. The commoners cried and fled in all directions. One by one, they bared their fangs and brandished their claws in pursuit. At night, panic, killing, and chaos filled every corner of the city. The heart-wrenching screams reached the wilderness outside the stronghold and gradually faded away. In the vast grassland of the wasteland, a black shadow was crawling at an extremely fast speed like a spider, but the head was that of a beautiful woman with snow-white skin. However, at this moment, her mouth was filled with sharp teeth, and the corners of her mouth were split open to her ears. It was as if her entire face had been torn apart horizontally, making her look incomparably sinister. She was crawling at an extremely fast speed, crawling towards the stronghold and the chaotic city behind it. In the distance behind her, the wall of sighs stood tall and silent. It was like a giant that didn't care about the screams and tragedies around it. The streets of the outer wall were brightly lit. Pubs were bustling and the smell of food was coming out from the roadside shops. The atmosphere was tranquil, but on the top of Wutuo Mountain in the center of the commercial district, it was a bit cold. Although lanterns were hung everywhere outside the temple, making it as bright as day, there was a lack of human presence. Only the occasional sound of communication could be heard from the sacrificial hall outside the square. "Master, someone has come to see you. He claims to be one of Glen's men." Noise came to the temple and reported to Dudian. Dudian's hand slightly paused. "Call him in." "Yes, young master." Noise turned and left. He soon led a young man in black clothes into the temple. The young man's head was half lowered after he entered the temple. He didn't dare to look directly in front of him, as he was afraid of offending the big shot. However, the corner of his eyes swept around. He was sizing up the most sacred hall in the outer wall. Dudian noticed his small movements but didn't say anything. "Where is Glen?" The young man looked up and saw Dudian's face. He didn't expect that the person who lived here wasn't the Pope but Dudian. As an assassin he would pay attention to famous people. He recognized Dudian's identity at a glance. Wasn't he the genius architect who had disappeared for a period of time? Why was he sitting in the temple? He had doubts in his heart, but he didn't dare to ask. He said in a low voice, "Your Excellency, I'm one of the assassins summoned by Lady Glen. My name is Nuria. Lady Glen accidentally exposed herself and died in the line of duty." "Died in the line of duty?" Noise looked at Dudian in disbelief. Dudian's heart sank. "Tell me what happened." Nuria knelt on the ground. "A big shot came to one of the locations where we were going to put the poison. Glen was unfortunately discovered and killed on the spot." Dudian's eyes were gloomy. "Which location?" "The 6th task point of the City of White." Nuria answered. Dudian thought for a moment and remembered this place. This place was dedicated to the military. It was one of the most dangerous points in the city. He was silent as he recalled the first time he met Glen. At that time, he was still a primary hunter. He had assisted her to hunt the Black Weaver. Since then, they had formed a friendship. It was also because of this friendship that she was willing to follow him after the collapse of Melon Consortium. She didn't choose other old consortia. He didn't expect that he would harm her this time. The hall became silent as Dudian was silent. Noise looked at Dudian with a complex expression. He thought of Nuria and the anger in his heart found an outlet. Why was Glen the one who poisoned Glen? Wasn't your task to assist her? Nuria knelt on the ground. "Elder, Glen said that it was too dangerous. She was worried that we wouldn't be able to deceive the eyes of the guards. I didn't expect. How did she die?" Dudian's eyes were cold. "Do you remember the appearance of the person who killed her?" Nuria hurriedly said, "This subordinate remembers it clearly. I also saw his medal. He was an officer of the military. He was lying in ambush at the place where Lady Glen broke out of the ground. He waited for Lady Glen to get out of the ground and then launched a sneak attack. He chopped off Lady Glen's head with one slash." Dudian closed his eyes. He could almost see the scene in front of him. He took a deep breath and slowly opened his eyes. "Have you completed the mission this time?" Nuria hurriedly replied. "Reporting to my lord, except for one location, all the other locations have been completed." "Which location?" "The 4th task point of the city of Florence." "I know. You can go back." Nuria was relieved as he saw that Dudian didn't punish him. He carefully got up and left. Noise clenched his fists after Nuria left. "Master, we can't let go of Glen's death. Before the start of the task I thought that they would be sacrificed and would encounter danger. Dudien's words startled Noyce. He looked at Dudien, who was looking out of the window at the dark night sky. But I didn't expect that she would be the one to be sacrificed. Noyce was silent. Indeed, the task was to infiltrate the inner wall, which was full of masters. It was a very dangerous task, and it was natural that there would be sacrifices. But she was the one to be sacrificed. He felt uncomfortable in his heart. Does Glen have any relatives? Dudien looked at Noyce. Chapter 684. Sister. Dean nodded. How old is she? Where is she? She should be 16 years old this year. She is studying in a law school. I heard that her grades are good. She is always the first in the class. Noyce said. You know a lot about her. Dean looked at him. Take 1,000 gold coins and go see her. Tell her about Glen. She has the right to know. Noyce was startled. Master, what if she asks about the cause of Glen's death? Then answer truthfully. But, Noyce carefully looked at him. What if she can't get over it? She will think that it was the task that caused her sister's death. So she will hate you, she is right. Dean replied. She is the only one who hates me. The dragon clan, the military, the monastery. They all want me dead. I don't care about them. Why would I be afraid of a child? Noyce looked at him. He felt sad but didn't say anything. He turned around and retreated. Glen. Dean silently put down the pen and sighed. Glen, Zack, Noyce and Sergei were the most trustworthy people around him. Mason and Zack were still training with the Hawkeye. It would take a while for them to help him. Glen was dead, so there was one less person he could trust. He suddenly felt that it might be a mistake to involve Mason and Zack in this matter. If he allowed them to live a peaceful life, they might be able to live to old age. However, if they followed him, they would inevitably encounter danger. For many secret missions, he could only send his most trusted people to do them. The word trust also contained a kind of emotion. He silently thought that since ancient times, all the people in power should have faced such a situation. They would send their most trusted people to perform the most dangerous task. It was like a theory. Could it be that for those in power, feelings are merely a tool to win over people's hearts? As he thought of this, he felt a little lost in his heart. Although he had a heart of stone, and if someone betrayed him, he would be ruthless. However, those who trusted him and never betrayed him died under his orders. This was the first time he had experienced such a feeling. Only after experiencing it did he realize that some things were completely different from what he thought and saw, and what he experienced himself. The thoughts that came out of it were also completely different. He turned his head to look at Aisha. There was a trace of tenderness in his indifferent eyes. But he suddenly thought of a problem. Will he encounter a strong enemy one day? Will he need to send her out to deal with it in order to save his life? Thinking of this, he suddenly felt a chill of fear. The gentleness in his eyes disappeared in an instant. He lowered his head and remained silent. After a while, he slowly sat up straight, and the confusion in his eyes dissipated. He could not change the various things he would face as a ruler, but he knew that the only thing he could do was to become stronger. He was so strong that there were no enemies, and there was no need to sacrifice the people around him to deal with him. Time flew by. Noyce returned to the temple at 9 o'clock in the evening. Dean saw him and asked, "How was it?" Noyce smiled bitterly, replying to young master, "I went there and met with her sister. But she insisted on coming to see you." Dudien was startled. "Bring her here." "I've brought her," Noyce said. "Shall I invite her in?" Dean nodded and squinted his eyes. He saw a figure standing outside the temple. Soon, a girl was brought in by Noyce. Dean looked at the girl and found that she was similar to Glen. But the lines of her cheeks were more beautiful, soft, and full of gentle temperament. There was less of Glen's temperament but more of gentleness. Dean saw tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry. It's me who killed your sister." The girl looked at Dean, who was sitting at the desk behind the step. She shook her head. You didn't kill my sister. Dean looked at her. Then why are you here? I want to get revenge for my sister. The girl stared at Dean. The gentleness on her face faded and was replaced by coldness and determination. Her temperament changed. I hope you can help me for the sake of my sister. Dean was surprised as he saw the instantaneous change in her temperament. He frowned. I'll get revenge. I promise you that I'll help your sister. No, I want to get revenge with my own hands. The girl said. No. Dean flatly refused. Your sister has died because of me. I can't drag you down with me. You should go back and read your books. In the future, your life will be very rich. Once my matter is settled, I will let you live the best life. No. Even if you don't help me, I'll find a way myself. No matter how long it takes, I'll find a way. Although the methods I can think of are limited, I'll definitely find that person to settle the score. If I'm killed because I'm too weak, I won't blame you. The young girl's eyes were resolute as she said, Even if you don't help me, I'll find a way. Dean was startled. He couldn't help but look at the girl. Her words made him look at her in a different light. It was obvious that she was forcing him to help her. But her words were very tactful. It was difficult for him to refuse. It was reasonable to say that most people would collapse when they heard the news of their sister's death. Most people would be filled with hatred and only want revenge. But she was still thinking about how to get him to help her. In other words, for her, revenge had already begun. Asking him to help her was the first step. Dean frowned and looked at her for a moment. Do you know that even if you get revenge, you may die if you follow me? I'm not afraid. The girl said in a sonorous voice, showing a very determined mind. Dean was silent. Your sister wants you to learn the law so that you can live a good life in the future. She is a hunter and has been stained with too much blood. She doesn't want you to get involved in it. Do you want to violate your sister's will? Do you think I can live a good life? The girl looked at Dean. I'll spend my sister's money and the money you gave me to buy food and clothes. Every time I eat, every time I see my clothes, I'll think of my sister. I'll think of the life she exchanged for me. How can I enjoy it so comfortably? Dean looked at her slightly moist eyes. His heart ached and he was speechless for a moment. The girl seemed to see through Dean's thoughts and said, Elder, you don't have to worry about me. I know that you feel guilty for harming my sister. You are worried that you will harm me. Please rest assured that if I die then I can only blame myself for not being good enough. It is not your fault. Elder, please don't take it to heart. Just think of me as a sword in your hand. Please polish me so that I can kill. Revenge. If one day this sword breaks, or is embroidered, sir, you can just discard it and find a better sword. Dean was shocked. He looked at her and saw a pair of bright but cold eyes. He was silent and pondered for a long time before he slowly opened his mouth and said, I understand. Since you insist on doing this, I will definitely use the best resources and hire the best teachers to teach you. I will definitely not let you follow in your sister's footstep. I will definitely let you become the sharpest sword and cut down all the ugliness and lowliness in this world for me. The girl's eyes lit up. She knelt down and kowtowed. Thank you, Elder. Dean didn't know whether his decision was right or wrong, but he didn't want to continue to think about it. Hesitation was not his style. He said, Get up. What's your name? Chapter 685. Aurora. Dean looked at Noyce. Arrange for her to rest in the hall. Yes, master. Noyce nodded. Dean said to Noyce after Noyce left, Call the top 3 assassins to come and train her. Noyce hesitated for a moment. Master, she is Glenn's only relative and the person she wants to protect the most. Isn't it? Are you worried that she will follow Glenn's footsteps? Dean saw through his thoughts. Revenge isn't a simple thing. She is just an ordinary person. She will have to go through a lot of hard training if she wants to surpass her sister. What is the thing that people are most afraid of? 99% of the people in this world are lazy. Laziness is unavoidable for everyone. If it's just a momentary anger, it will slowly fade with time under the strict training. If she flinches, we will have a reason to let her leave and return to her original life. Noyce smiled. I don't think that the girl is an ordinary child. I don't think she is just talking about it. Then we have no reason to stop her. Dean said. Even if we stop her now, she will inevitably do some unpredictable stupid things. Instead of that, it is better to give her hope. If she can persist, then we can't shake her determination. There is no reason to continue to stop her. Noyce understood that Dean wanted her to retreat. Indeed, the girl had to become a top assassin from an ordinary person if she wanted to take revenge. The road in between was too long and too hard. Anger, hatred, and even love would fade over time. This was probably the most terrible thing about time. It could wear away all beliefs. He sighed in his heart. Dean wrote a letter to Richelieu after Noyce left. Everything was ready now. The inner wall was in chaos and the slums were about to be vacated. It was time to introduce the barbarians into the wall. They would become a force in his hands during the war. He intended to leave this matter to Richelieu. It had been some time since he came back from the Savage Mountain. He didn't know whether the youth called Ianlar could suppress the barbarians and sit firmly on the throne. But it didn't matter even if he couldn't sit firmly on the throne. Dudian was his solid backing. With the assistance of the military, he could support a new puppet to be the king even if he was defeated. This night is a bit long. Dudian looked at the sighing wall in the distance. After Noyce came back, he asked Noyce to summon Nuria. He told him to take people to check the movements in the inner wall. If all the targets have been poisoned, then the inner wall should be in chaos at this moment. On the Savage Mountain outside the fortress, the hills were high and dark. Savages liked to live in caves, where they could avoid the attacks of wild beasts and the cold. There were only a few tents at the top of the mountain that gave off a weak light. Ianlar was sitting in the chieftain's tent drinking wine. His eyes were gloomy. He had not been able to sleep for the past few days. After killing his father and replacing him, he was attacked by an assassin on the first night. Fortunately, he was vigilant and wasn't injured. The assassin was sent by his uncle to avenge his father. Although he covered up the cause of his father's death, but he couldn't hide it from everyone. At the moment there were 7 or 8 teams patrolling outside his tent. He couldn't sleep at all. He suddenly felt that sitting in this position wasn't as comfortable as he imagined. It was like there were many needles pricking his body. If he relaxed a little, then the needles would stab him. Patriarch, the kid inside the wall, said that he would migrate us into the wall. Do you think that this is a conspiracy of the people inside the wall? Inside the tent, there was a woman dressed in beast clothing with sharp beast teeth hanging all over her body. Her face was painted with sacrificial god patterns. Her skin was dark and full of heroic spirit. Ianlar narrowed his eyes and said word by word, "You don't have to worry about this matter. When the day comes, I will send some people to follow me into the wall to check the situation first. If that is the case, you and the rest of the people will immediately leave this place. Hide and accumulate your strength. When the time comes, you will attack the wall and avenge us." "Patriarch, are you going in person? Isn't it too dangerous?" Another man with a huge axe scar on his shoulder frowned. "The tribes have been obedient. With our current strength, why should we listen to the words of the kid inside the wall? Even if we can't beat the wall, can he kill us all? This is our world outside the wall. Let him try." Ianlar looked at him. "Don't talk nonsense. That person is not an ordinary person. His strength is far beyond your imagination. Even Warrior Tomb may not be able to resist his punch. So strong." The burly man was shocked. Ianlar said in a cold voice, "If I didn't have such strength, then why would I be willing to be his puppet?" Everyone in the tent looked at each other, speechless. The night was getting darker. Dean and Noyce were arranging the alchemists of the Dark Church to build solar power station. Footsteps were heard from outside the square. Dean looked up and knew that Gwyneth had come back. He stopped and waited for Gwyneth to enter the door. "Master, I'm back." Gwyneth entered the temple and said respectfully to Dean. Dean frowned as he saw that her clothes were tattered. "Did someone attack you?" Gwyneth shook her head and smiled bitterly. "Young master, I have completed the task you gave me. I found the tungsten steel cage you mentioned. There are 2 monsters inside, one big and one small. Both of them are on the verge of death." Dean was relieved. It seemed that the 2 splitters were trapped in the cage and didn't leave. He was gratified and surprised that the splitter didn't break the cage. It was reasonable to say that after such a long period of growth, it should have entered the mature stage. It would be easy for it to tear the tungsten cage. I wanted to get closer to take a look, but a monster jumped out from the side of the cage. It looked like a hedgehog. Its body was huge, and its body was covered with soft and sticky limbs. It wanted to kill me. Fortunately, young master had given me God's marrow, which helped my physique to break through. I didn't dare to stay and ran all the way back. Gwyneth said. Dudian was startled. "Do you know the monster that attacked you?" Gwyneth shook her head. "I don't know. I think you can find its information in the Atlas of the Inner Wall." Chapter 686. Dean took Aisha and Gwyneth down Utopia Mountain. They crossed the fortress and went to the giant wall passage. Gwyneth ran at full speed but found that she could barely keep up with Dean's pace. She was now a limitless expert and her strength had made a qualitative leap. But she didn't expect that the gap between her and Dean was getting farther and farther. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The 3 of them arrived in front of the giant wall passage. There were no Knights of Light stationed here. Dean had asked Barton to withdraw the guards to make it convenient for Gwyneth to go in and out, but it would be difficult to detect if any monster sneaked into the giant wall. Dean lifted the iron plate on the ground and entered the familiar giant wall passage. The goddess engraved on both sides of the passage had a smile on her face. She looked mysterious under the flickering lights. Dudian asked Gwyneth to lead the way as they moved at high speed outside the giant wall. Half an hour later, the 3 of them came to a grassy plain. Collapsed buildings could be seen in the messy grass, but they had long been pierced by tenacious grasses and branches. It looked like a giant that had fallen to the ground. Dean wiped the dagger in his hand. It was stained with the blood of the nocturnal monsters that he had killed along the way. He put away the dagger and lurked in the grass. He quietly approached the front. His vision had captured 3 heat sources. 2 of them were slightly wriggling together. The other one was a huge ball with a diameter of about 13 or 14 meters. However, the heat response was relatively weak. It was like a dim sunset. The density of the heat source was not much different from the heat source density of an intermediate-level hunter. Gwyneth pointed to the front, indicating that it was there. Dean narrowed his eyes. Although the night was dark, he could still see a huge cage in the grass. There were 2 monsters in the cage. One was big and one was small. They were the 2 splitters that he had imprisoned in the cage. Now that half a year had passed, the 2 little splitters hadn't changed much. According to normal growth, their current size should be more than 3 times the size of the cage, but the 2 of them were squeezed in the tungsten steel cage like a black net that bound their bodies, causing their flesh to bulge out of the holes, making it almost impossible for them to move. Dean woke up as he saw this. He suddenly knew why they couldn't break out of the cage. In such a situation, it was difficult for them to twist their body, let alone attack the cage. Moreover, it was estimated that it was very difficult for them to grow to this stage. The scarcity of food coupled with the restraint of the cage had made their development deformed. Dean suddenly felt a trace of cruelty, but he knew that it was the instinctive sympathy he felt when he saw the tragic scene in the cage. Hiss! At this time, the 2 little splits in the cage suddenly let out a whining roar. It sounded like a threat, but also like a plea. Their bodies that were strangled by the cage twisted with difficulty. The flesh that bulged out of the cage was squeezed because of the twisting, and blood oozed out. The hard shell outside their body seemed to have degenerated, becoming extremely fragile. At this time, Dean saw a huge shadow slowly approaching the cage. It looked like a giant black ball with black limbs. If it wasn't for its huge size, it would look like a head full of hair. However, these hair were as thick as a bowl. They were exuding evil and terrifying aura as they twisted towards the two little splitters in the cage. The two little splitters screamed and struggled fiercely. However, the black limbs got close to them. Several of the black limbs pierced into the cage and penetrated into the flesh. The two little splitters screamed. Dean's face slightly changed. He had never seen this giant black ball monster. Even in the monster encyclopedia of the inner wall, he didn't see it. Even in the monster encyclopedia of the wasteland that was given to him by the Dragon Clan, there wasn't such a strange monster. Is this a new mutation? Dean's heart moved. The monster encyclopedia was often updated to record the information of the latest mutation. Obviously, the information of this monster hasn't been recorded by the Monster Research Institute in the encyclopedia yet. As he was thinking, the struggle of the two little splitters became more and more intense. The cage shook and turned over on the ground. A few of the black limbs were pressed under the cage and quickly retracted. The rest of the black limbs instantly swarmed up and pierced through the holes on the outside of the cage, wrapping around the entire cage. If a person with trypophobia saw this scene, he would have been scared to death. Dean didn't wait any longer. He was ready to make a move. If it continued, then the parasitic soul worms of the two little splitters would be gone. When he was about to get up, the black limbs suddenly retracted and put the cage on the ground. Dean was startled. Judging from the heat source, the two little splitters weren't dead. Why did it suddenly stop? At this time, the giant black ball monster slowly rolled to the distance. It seemed to have given up on killing the two little splitters. Dean was more puzzled. Suddenly, his eyes noticed the appearance of the two little splitters. They were on the verge of death. Moreover, their bodies seemed to be thinner. The flesh that was bulging outside the cage was much thinner. The most important thing was that there were no scars on the bulging parts. Not a drop of blood flowed out. Dean was startled for a moment. He suddenly realized that this new mutation should be some kind of blood-sucking monster. The limbs that had penetrated into the body of the little splitters had a leech-like effect. It could swallow the blood of the host without tearing the wound. No wonder it didn't kill them. Obviously, it used them as its own blood bag. Seeing that it was about to leave, Dean didn't stay any longer. He said to Gwyneth, "You wait here." Then he shook the bell and quickly chased after it with Aisha. The giant black ball monster noticed that Dean and Aisha were chasing after it. Its body slowly stopped. A large number of black limbs were emitted from its body and quickly shot towards Dean and Aisha. Apparently, it regarded them as prey. Dean coldly snorted and shook the bell to let Aisha make a move. Roar! Aisha roared as her speed skyrocketed. She jumped on the black monster and bit its black limbs. The black monster's body immediately sunk. The surrounding black limbs swarmed up and closed Aisha's body. It was as if it was hugging her in its arms. Dean saw through the heat reaction that there was a missing human figure in the black monster's body. It seemed that Aisha had entered its body. Moreover, it seemed that it took the initiative to send her in. What kind of structure is this? Does it want to digest her? Dean roared and pulled out the dagger. He stimulated the power of the magic mark. White bones gushed out of his body like a skeleton. He roared and grabbed one of the black limbs. He pounced on its body and fiercely waved the dagger. Chapter 687. The dagger sank into the body of the black monster without much resistance. At the same time, Dean felt a sticky suction coming from his chest, pulling him into the body of the black monster. "Do you want to swallow me?" Dean's face slightly changed. He immediately backhanded the surface of the black monster's body. At the same time, He stimulated the wings on his back, fanning out a huge propulsion force to pull his body out inch by inch. However, the black monster seemed to be aware of his intention. Its body suddenly secreted a large amount of viscous and smooth liquid. The suction from its body became stronger. It was like a creeping swamp. Dean's palm that was patted on the surface of the black monster's body was stuck and slowly sank into it. His face changed. He wanted to withdraw his hand, but his palm was firmly grasped by the invisible suction. It was difficult to pull it out by relying on the strength of the wings. If he used the strength of his body, it would cause the opposite propulsion force and make his body sink faster. At this moment of crisis, he forced himself to calm down. He glanced to the side and saw that Aisha's body had sunk deeper into its body. She was struggling fiercely, but it didn't seem to have any effect. Instead, it made her body sink faster. She was slowly approaching the center of its body. Dean's heart tightened as he felt a bit of danger. The monster's heat response was mediocre, but its body structure was extremely special. It made him feel powerless. Even Aisha, who was far stronger than him, couldn't do anything to it. Was it possible to escape this disaster only if she released all of her strength? Dean's heart was filled with killing intent. He didn't expect to encounter such a tricky monster so close to the giant wall. If it wasn't necessary, he didn't want to see Aisha release all of her power. Moreover, the frequent release of her power was very easy to get out of control in the current situation where the conditioned reflex training was not deep enough. Just as he was hesitating, he suddenly felt that his hand that had sunk into the monster's body was slippery. No matter how he clenched his fist or scratched, it was to no avail. The monster's internal organs were not like the flesh and blood of an ordinary creature. Instead, they were like soft mud. He turned around and shouted at Gwyneth, who was squatting in the dark grass behind him. "Come on, use fire to attack." Gwyneth didn't expect that Dean would ask her for help. She rushed out of the grass and took out a match. She took out a kerosene torch and ran 50 meters away from the black monster. "What should I do? How should I attack with fire?" "Throw me the torch," Dudian shouted. Gwyneth looked at the monster with its black limbs floating in the air. She hesitated for a moment before rushing out. When the black ball monster felt Gwyneth approaching, its body suddenly trembled and crawled forward. Dean was happy to see its reaction. He knew that there was hope. Gwyneth threw the torch at Dudian. Whoosh! The black limbs floating around the black ball monster's body suddenly swung, slapping the torch away. Sparks flew everywhere, and the torch was instantly extinguished. Its black limbs also retracted like lightning, as if it had been scalded. Dean's face slightly changed as he saw the extinguished torch, but he immediately shouted at Gwyneth, "Give me the match." Gwyneth knew that the monster was afraid of fire. She looked at the messy black limbs floating in the air. She had a lingering fear, but she still plucked up her courage and jumped towards Dean. The black ball monster waved its limbs and slapped the black limbs that had previously hit the torch. It looked like a child who was holding his fingers and blowing air. It didn't pay any attention to Gwyneth. Gwyneth's jump was very accurate as she landed right under Dean's feet. She immediately threw the match in her hand to Dean. Dean quickly grabbed it. His fingers nimbly opened the matchbox and pulled out a match from inside. He held the matchbox between his two fingers and rubbed the match against each other. Sizzle! Flames rose from the matchbox. The black ball monster was startled as it sensed the temperature of the match. All of its black limbs attacked Dean. Dean didn't give it a chance at all. He put his finger on the flame of the firewood. With a hissing sound, the flame suddenly burned his finger. His hand was previously sucked into the monster's body, so it was stained with a slippery liquid. At this moment, the flame burned his whole palm. It looked like he had practiced the flame palm. Dean didn't feel any pain. His face didn't change. He took advantage of the burning palm and immediately stuck it to the monster's body. His fingertips slightly bent and pierced into the monster's body. Whoosh! The moment his fingers pierced into the monster's body, a burst of violent flame suddenly burst out and illuminated Dean's eyes. The next moment there was a loud bang as the monster's body suddenly exploded. The impact of the explosion threw Dean into the air. The world rotated rapidly. The burning sensation spread throughout his body as if he was in a sea of fire. Pain came from his face and chest. He felt his body hit the ground hard and almost fainted from the pain, but the figure that flashed in his mind made him ignore the pain all over his body. He hurriedly opened his eyes and saw that the black monster's body had exploded into pieces and scattered all over the ground, igniting the nearby weeds and burning them into piles of flames. His usually calm face showed a rare panic. He anxiously looked around and soon saw a figure crawling up from the grass. The figure was roaring angrily. Her whole body was burning with flames. It was Aisha. He rushed over in a hurry. He didn't notice that his body was also burning with flames. Aisha turned her head to look at Dean. She roared and pounced on him with her claws and fangs. Dean was shocked and quickly shook the bell. Aisha's body stopped for a moment. The next moment, Dean threw her body down. He hugged her and rolled several times on the ground. Soon, the flames on his and Aisha's body were submerged by the sand and gradually extinguished. Dean stood up and saw Aisha lying motionless in the sand. He slowly lifted her up. He saw that her clothes had been burned black and hung in tatters. Her pale skin had many burns. He felt sorry for her and held her in his arms. Aisha stood in a daze and let him hold her in his arms. After a while, Dean gradually calmed down. His whole body was burning in pain, making him grit his teeth slightly. He looked down at himself and found that his condition was terrible. His chest was burnt, his clothes were burned, and the skin on his chest was burned to varying degrees. His body was trembling with pain and his face was pale. At this time, he suddenly thought of Gwyneth. He hurriedly turned his head and looked around. Soon, he saw a weak heat source lying on the grass. He rushed over and saw Gwyneth lying on the ground like a man on fire. Her whole body was burning. He quickly picked up the sand on the ground and covered her body to extinguish the flames. He saw that Gwyneth's body was almost burned. She was on the verge of death. She had already fainted. Dean saw that her heart was still beating weakly, and his heart was a little relieved. He turned her body and saw that the first aid bag on her back had been burned, and the contents inside were scattered on the ground. Only a few bottles and cans were still intact. He picked up the bottles and cans. They were boiling hot. He unscrewed them and poured out the powder. He sprinkled it on Gwyneth's body. It was like sprinkling cumin on barbecued food. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He immediately picked up Gwyneth and went back to Aisha. He gently put her down and turned to look at the place where the monster exploded. There were only some fur and black limbs left on the ground. These black limbs were still gently wriggling like a snake with its head cut off. Dean's face slightly changed. He didn't expect to meet an unknown monster and almost lose his life. Fortunately, his guess was right. The monster's body was mainly made of fat. It was best to attack with fire. If he encountered it alone, once it was sucked into its body, it was estimated that even a pioneer would not be able to escape death. Although the monster's speed and strength were average, but it could softly dissolve all the power. He couldn't help but think of an old Chinese saying, "Good is like water." This monster was obviously using the flexibility of water to the extreme. Even if Aisha was strong, it would be difficult to hurt it. Instead, she would be trapped by it and slowly digested in its body. What a terrible monster! Dean was secretly afraid. He didn't know how this new species evolved. He also didn't know how it crossed the wasteland and came to this cleared area. He gently took a breath and endured the burning pain. He slowly came to the center of the explosion. The monster's body had completely exploded. There was a big pit on the ground. There was nothing left. He took a deep look and secretly remembered the monster's appearance. At this time, Gwyneth woke up. She snorted and wrinkled her face in pain. Dean immediately returned to her and picked her up. He brought Aisha back to the tungsten steel cage. He looked at the two little splitters struggling in the cage. There was a trace of a sigh in his eyes. Since it is so painful to live, then let's end it. He once again stimulated the power of magic marks. White bone armor emerged on his body. He put down Gwyneth and went straight to the cage. He opened the cage, but the two little splitters seemed to have grown in the cage. Although the cage door was opened, they didn't respond and didn't climb out. They seemed to have forgotten what freedom was after being imprisoned for a long time. Dean gritted his teeth as he endured the injuries on his body. He quickly pulled the two splitters out of the cage and beheaded them. The two little splitters wailed and fought back, but there was a huge gap between their strength. Moreover, after being imprisoned for a long time, their limbs were extremely stiff. The hard scythe blades outside their bodies had also become extremely fragile. It was as if the hard calcium inside the blades had been worn away. After killing them, Dean quickly dismembered them and soon found two parasitic soul worms in their bodies. He sighed in his heart. The healthy little splitter had chased him into the giant wall and regarded him as one of its own kind. It was a kind of emotion that came from the blood. He could feel it from its body. But he also knew that it was a cruel monster. Violence and killing were its nature. He had thought about taming it. It would become a trump card in his hands in the future to help him kill the enemy. But looking at its appearance now, it was obvious that there was no value in taming it. In the end, it was just a tool. Even if a snake tamer managed to tame a venomous snake, he would still guard against its bestial nature acting up and biting him. How many people would dare to sleep with a venomous snake? Because of the difference in species, it seemed that there was no trust from the beginning. Just like the different classes in the giant wall, there was no fairness from the beginning. He put the two parasitic soul worms into the empty bottle. He was ready to go back to the giant wall and replace it with a special bottle to store parasitic soul worms. He turned around and picked up Gwyneth. He shook the bell and went back to the wall with Aisha. Before leaving, he looked back at the place where the explosion happened. There was a trace of deep color in his eyes. There was an inexplicable ominous premonition in his heart. It was late at night. Dean went all the way to the suburbs of the fortress. He sneaked into a tailor's shop and stole 3 sets of clothes. He changed them for Gwyneth, Aisha and himself. Dean immediately asked Noyce to call the priest to come and treat Gwyneth. He also prepared a healing potion for him. He soaked the herbs in a wooden basin and washed Aisha's body. He helped her change into clean clothes. At this time the priest also came and took Gwyneth to be treated. He also used the healing ointment to clean his body. He said to Noyce, "Sergei and a few trustworthy people to go 70 miles to the west of the giant wall. There are 2 monster corpses there. Remember to keep it a secret." Noyce was shocked to see Dean being so cautious. He guessed that the 2 monsters were extraordinary. Otherwise, it was impossible to injure Dean so seriously. It was the first time that he saw Dean in such a mess since he got out of the prison. Moreover, Aisha, who was able to kill pioneers, was seriously injured. It was obvious that the danger they encountered outside the giant wall was beyond his imagination. He immediately turned to find someone to pass down the order. After a moment, Noyce returned to the temple. He looked at Dean, who was still sitting at the desk. He was worried. "Master, it's getting late. You are seriously injured. You should rest early." "The enemies haven't rested. How can I have time to rest?" Dean said. He really wanted to lie down and relax his body. But he couldn't afford to be careless at this critical moment. He asked, "Is there any news from the inner wall? Nuria came 10 minutes before you came back." He said that the inner wall was in a mess. There was an outbreak of zombie plague. Many people were infected and turned into undead. The streets were in chaos. Noyce immediately reported. He couldn't help but look at Dean. Obviously, this result was caused by Dean. It was what he needed. But he didn't care about the lives of countless people. Dean nodded slightly. The coldness in his eyes calmed down a bit. He said, "Immediately call 2 of the best priests and doctors. I must fully recover before tomorrow night." Noyce was startled. "Master, what are you going to do?" "I wanted to sneak into the inner wall and grab a few people from their Monster Research Institute. But it seems that it won't work," Dean said. "I've been delayed for today. I can't wait for tomorrow." Noyce knew Dean's intention. "I'll go." "Zombies." Dean looked out of the window and muttered, "Nobles have turned into undeads. Let's see how you will be in awe." The towering wall of size separated the 2 places like a natural moat. In the city that stretched for hundreds of miles, chaotic roars and shouts of killing could be heard. Some of the wooden houses were burned and collapsed, crushing women and children who were running away in panic. The children's cries of pain were particularly loud in the night. Beside them were the people who were running away in panic. No one reached out to help. The cries attracted the strange and ferocious-looking figures behind them. They pounced on the survivors like evil spirits. The once bustling streets were in complete chaos. It was like hell on earth. Chapter 688. Time flew by and another day passed in the blink of an eye. After the treatment of several priests and doctors, his internal injuries were completely healed. His face and chest were also healed with special medicines contributed by the Dark Church's alchemists. Although the alchemists' process of making medicines was inhumane and cruel, they used living people for experiments, but the effects of the medicines were extraordinary. Dean dealt with the problems of the poor and the nobles brought by Barton. He called Noyce and asked him to accompany Barton to preside over the overall situation. The outer wall wasn't peaceful in the last few days. Although the problem of the migration of the poor didn't cause a fierce resistance, but there was still a lot of controversy. But because of the pressure from the Dark Church and the military, they didn't make it too obvious. "Don't make it public that I'm going to the inner wall." Dean looked at both of them. "No matter what the problem is, ease it up and wait for me to come back." "Yes, Master." Barton nodded. Noyce looked at Dean. "Master, are you going alone?" "2 people." Dean replied. "Don't worry." Noyce didn't say much. Dean put on the stealth armor as the night was getting dark. He put on the splitter that he made from the body of the splitter. Together with Aisha they left Utopia Mountain. They went through the suburbs and went to the edge of the giant wall. The population was relatively sparse in the places close to the giant wall. Most of them were old villages and small towns. Most of them were old people and children. Most of the young people had left the villages to work in the commercial district. The villages were dark at night. Only a few houses were lit with lights. Dean took Aisha to the giant wall. He stimulated the wings on his back and grabbed her arm to climb up the giant wall. The wind on the giant wall was a bit strong. Aisha's hair fluttered in the wind. She wasn't injured in the explosion. Only her clothes were burned. Her body was protected by the dragon's scales. She wasn't burnt like Dean and Gwyneth. Dean took her along the giant wall towards the inner wall. Along the way, he looked at the gray clouds and the desolate night view outside the wall. He could vaguely see some monsters crawling in the night. From time to time there would be sharp screams. It was extremely loud in the wilderness. Dean's nervous heart gradually calmed down. His eyes fell on Aisha's body from time to time. She was expressionless, and there wasn't the slightest emotion in her pure black eyes. She seemed to be thinking about something. Dean's fingers tightened as he whispered, "We'll be able to find a way to make you recover once we reach the Monster Institute." Aisha was silent. Dean's pace gradually accelerated. He saw that the number of soldiers stationed on the wall was less than half of the previous ones. It seemed that the corpses in the inner wall were more serious than he had expected. It seemed that the military was having a hard time dealing with it. He lowered his body and followed Aisha to the place where the wall was erected. They continued to move forward for more than 2,000 meters before jumping off the giant wall and landing on the grass. He took Aisha to the next official road. He hoped that he wouldn't meet the pioneer woman here. He hoped that she had already reached the city. After walking along the official road for more than 30 miles, Dean suddenly heard a sound of hooves in front of him. He immediately stopped and looked into the distance. It was a convoy. There were 3 carriages and more than a dozen horses. It didn't look like an army. When the distance was close, Dean saw that the 3 carriages had a patterned totem inserted on them. Although he hadn't seen the patterned totem, it was very similar to the aristocrats of the outer wall. The armor of more than a dozen knights who were escorting the carriages were also engraved with the same patterned totem. Dean's eyes flashed a trace of black light. He immediately saw the heat inside the bodies of these knights. He found that the strongest among them was just a high-level lemeter. He breathed a sigh of relief and walked towards the convoy. A blond middle-aged knight quickly noticed Dean and Aisha in the lane. He immediately pulled the rope and slowed down the speed. He shouted, "Who are you?" Dean waited for him to stop and asked, "It's so late. Where are you going in such a hurry?" "It's none of your business," the middle-aged knight shouted angrily. He suddenly noticed Aisha next to him. Aisha was wearing a veil. She was wearing a cheongsam that Dean had specially made for her. It was made according to her original favorite style. It fit her very well. There was a trace of surprise in the middle-aged knight's eyes. He had heard some rumors about this unique style of clothes. His face changed slightly. Dean noticed the change in the middle-aged knight's eyes. He squinted. "Aren't you afraid of being attacked by the beasts outside when you leave the city at night?" The middle-aged knight turned to look at Dean. When he was about to open his mouth, an anxious voice came from the carriage behind. "Why are you still stopping? Run." "Yes, master." The middle-aged knight turned back to the convoy and nodded respectfully. Then he turned to Dean. "Both of you, please get out of the way. There is an outbreak of zombie plague in the city. I advise both of you to leave as soon as possible. Don't go back to the city." "Come out to escape?" Dean put away the killing intent in his heart and didn't say anything. The middle-aged knight patted his horse and rode past Dean. He moved forward with the carriage. Dean took Aisha's hand and continued to move forward. According to the drawings brought back by Gwyneth, there was a city called Carmen more than 10 miles away. The Monster Institute he was looking for tonight was in this city. 10 minutes later, Dean saw a fortress in the distance. The gate of the fortress was completely open. There were some shadows wandering in front of the gate. They walked in a strange posture. Although he didn't see their faces clearly, Dean recognized them at a glance. They were undeads. He had seen too many of them outside the giant wall. "It seems that the fortress has fallen." Dean's eyes flashed slightly. He had arranged for people to poison the drinking water sources of the fortresses of each city. It seemed to be effective. However, there were still some living figures fighting on the fortresses. At the same time, there were roars and screams. Dean's eyes flashed. At the moment, most of the Carmen city had turned into a sea of corpses. He didn't know whether the Monster Institute could withstand it or not. But he didn't send people to poison the water source near the Monster Institute. If they were aware of the situation outside in time, they could use the Institute as a cover to hide inside. Chapter 689. Dean took out the Walking Dead powder that had been prepared in his waist bag and smeared it on his armor. A strong rotten smell came out and covered his own smell. He used the dragon blood technique to control the blood flow rate in his body and reduce the heat. Then he walked straight to the fortress with Aisha. The undeads wandering outside the fortress seemed to feel something and slowly stopped. Dean looked at their pale faces. Some of the undeads had large bloodstains on their mouth. At this moment, they were all staring at him. Dean was calm. The Walking Dead powder he brought was of the highest grade. Even if the physique of these undeads was different from that of ordinary people, he could still fool them. He walked directly over. At this time, these undeads suddenly moved, but they did not rush to Dean. Instead, they avoided him as if they had encountered something fearful. They hid on both sides of the road, their bodies shivering. Dean was startled. Suddenly, he thought of Aisha. Were these undeads afraid of her? When he walked to the front of the fortress, a soldier fell from the front of the fortress. His body slammed to the ground and he spat out a mouthful of blood. A large blood mark was torn on his arm. He was seriously injured at this moment. When he saw Dean and Aisha coming, he was scared and hurriedly climbed up. When he was about to fight, he suddenly saw Dean's ruddy and white skin, which was completely different from the paleness of the undeads. Moreover, Dean's eyes were calm, not full of violent, bloodthirsty eyes. He was stunned for a moment and said, You are a human?" His eyes slowly turned and looked at the shivering corpse companion behind Dean. The whole person was stunned. This scene was too strange. Dean pushed his body away and led Aisha straight into the open door behind him. He did not pay attention to the injured soldier. After he entered the fortress, the screams of the injured soldiers suddenly sounded outside the door, resounding through the night sky. Dean and Aisha walked all the way forward. From time to time, a few undeads in soldier armor rushed over. But when they got close to them, they stopped and shivered. The strange reaction of these undeads made Dean pay attention to it. Obviously, the reaction of these undeads was probably because of Aisha. But what puzzled him was that the undeads had no consciousness. They didn't even have thoughts. They didn't know pain and fear. So why were they afraid of Aisha? It should be noted that having the commander consciousness meant that it had the ability to think. However, the undead had no consciousness, and this had already been proven countless times. Even in the face of monsters that were countless times stronger than them, they would still rush forward without fear of death. Could it be that they are only afraid of their own kind? Dean's eyes flashed. He felt that there should be some deeper secrets hidden in the body of the undead. This secret may have been reflected long ago, but no one was aware of it. It was like the era without technology. People could feel the air, but they didn't know the composition of the air. They just lacked the tools to explore. The more he thought about it, the more he wanted to see the Demonic Creature Research Institute. They studied demonic creatures all year round, and it was unknown how many secrets they had hidden. "Help!" Screams came from the surrounding barrack. Dean turned his head and saw that the screams didn't attract the help of other survivors. Instead, it attracted the nearby undead. They pounced on them and tore them apart. Soon their intestines were thrown out. Dean didn't make a move. He walked all the way with Aisha. The surrounding world of slaughter seemed to be isolated from him. The two were like walking in the heavy battlefield jungle, but not a single leaf touched them. The two walked out of the fortress. The soil behind them had turned blood red, and the sand in their footprints was mixed with blood. Behind the fortress was a spacious road leading to the towering Carmen city in front. They could clearly see the wall lamps hanging on the more than 20 meters high city gate. At the moment, there were a lot of figures jumping on the city wall, and from time to time, a few sharp arrows were shot outside the city. Dean looked up. The top of the city wall was also in chaos, and it was occupied by the undead. He silently walked to the city gate with Aisha. The city gate was unlatched, and he pushed it open with one hand. The squeaking sound spread, and suddenly there was a roar of the undeads at the city gate. Dean didn't have any fear. He took Aisha and strode forward. As soon as the undeads wandering at the city gate approached, the ferocious expression on their faces stopped. They swayed to the side of the road, shivering, and didn't dare to approach. Dean glanced around. There were screams coming from the streets outside the city gate. Some of the houses were ignited by the overturned oil lamp. It was a mess. He estimated that most of the other cities were in the same situation. There was a trace of pity in his heart. He couldn't help but ask himself, should I use other methods to contain the actions of the military and the monastery? But as soon as this idea came out, it was strangled by him. He abandoned the softness in his heart. He thought that it was hypocritical to sympathize with the undeads now. Thinking of this, he took out the map in his arms, looked at it, and immediately took Aisha along the left side of the street. The street was in chaos. Some houses were closed. Through the heat captured by the vision, he could see people hiding in the houses, huddled together, shivering. When the disaster broke out, not everyone was infected with the ptomaine. When the undeads rushed to the street and caused a disturbance, most of the people on the street were scared and fled back to their homes. Dean walked along the street and immediately saw the bitten and bloody corpses on the roadside. Some of them were less than 1 meter tall, and the bodies of women. There was also a gray-haired old man whose chest was torn open, lying on the ground. Dean glanced at them, and didn't stop walking all the way forward. "Help! Help me!" When he came to the street, a woman suddenly jumped out of the alley and threw herself into Dean's arms, crying and begging. At the same time, she looked back in horror. Dean also looked behind her. There was a 15 or 16-year-old boy chasing after her. His face was ferocious, and his mouth was stained with blood. Dean was about to kill him. Suddenly, the woman grabbed his back and pushed him. At the same time, she took the opportunity to escape to the other side of the street. Dean stood firm and turned his head to look at her escaping figure. His eyes narrowed, and a trace of killing intent flashed in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared. He thought that such a situation was not unusual. He didn't lower himself to the woman's level and continued to move forward. After the young undeads rushed out of the alley, they sensed Aisha's smell. They immediately stopped and stood shivering. Dean followed the map all the way forward. Along the way, he saw a lot of people being chased and bitten to death by the undead. He didn't deliberately attack. Some people had been bitten, but he was too lazy to care. Sooner or later, they would die anyway. After walking for more than 10 minutes, Dean had entered the inner area of the city. He suddenly saw a large number of soldiers surrounding a square in a neat formation, and a large number of passers-by gathered in the square, shouting loudly, "Get out of the way, bastard! We are not infected. Why are you catching us? Why are you stopping us instead of killing those monsters?" Chapter 690. Dean saw a middle-aged officer come out from the army. His skin was white and seemed to be in good condition. He walked out of the crowd, looked at the noisy crowd, and said loudly, "If you don't want to die, all of you better be quiet." The cursing from the crowd paused for a moment, and they looked at him fearfully. The middle-aged officer whispered a few words to his adjutant. The adjutant nodded and said, "Miss Alice, please come out." Everyone in the square looked at each other in dismay. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the crowd. The crowd retreated, revealing a slender and elegant young girl wearing a white silk hood. She was dressed elegantly. There were 2 knights around the girl. Their posture was straight and their attitude was humble. The middle-aged officer's eyes lit up when he saw this young girl. He immediately led a few attendants and entered the square from outside the defensive line. Along the way, the surrounding people made way for them. They were shocked, angry, fearful, and scared, not daring to stop them. "Miss Alice, are you hurt?" The middle-aged officer came up to the girl, placed his hand on his chest, and bowed respectfully. The girl called Alice looked at him impatiently. "What's the matter? Say it quickly." The middle-aged officer was very polite. "Miss, we were ordered to pick you up. Now the zombie plague is breaking out everywhere. It's very dangerous. Please come back with us." Hope emerged in the eyes of the civilians as they heard his words. They grabbed the middle-aged officer and begged, "Sir, please take us away. I beg you, please take us away." A few attendants beside the middle-aged officer immediately blocked the rioting commoners. One of the attendants pushed a filthy commoner away in disgust. He used a lot of strength and directly flipped the commoner over. The commoner fell to the ground and was immediately trampled by the people behind him. Alice heard the noise around her and became even more impatient. She said, "I don't want to go back. I still have to go to Christine to get my evening gown. I have a banquet to attend tonight. Tell my father that when the banquet starts, I will definitely be home." The middle-aged officer smiled. "Miss, the zombie plague is breaking out everywhere. It's too dangerous. We can't afford to take responsibility if something happens to you." "Then you have to protect me," Alice said in an indifferent tone. "We don't raise people like you to do nothing. You can't even deal with a small zombie plague. You are useless." The middle-aged officer was speechless and felt a headache. Suddenly, he smiled and said, "Miss, the scale of the zombie plague is too big. It has swept the whole city. When I came here, I noticed that all the shops were closed, including Christine. Even if you go now, you probably won't be able to get your evening dress. Instead, you will be in danger. How about I help you find another tailor shop and buy another set?" "How can other shops compare to the dresses made by Christine?" Alice looked at him disdainfully as if she was looking at a retard. Then she slightly raised her chin and said, "Even if they are closed, it's okay. My family is Christine's VIP. Even if they are closed, they will still serve me. Don't be so long-winded. There are so many people here. It stinks. Get out of the way." The middle-aged officer was about to persuade her again when he suddenly heard a scream from the back of the square. His heart skipped a beat. He quickly looked up and saw a large crowd coming from the back of the square. On the street behind, 4 or 5 figures were running at high speed. Their running postures were strange. They swayed and swayed. Their hands looked like they were paddling forward. His expression changed slightly. He immediately said to Alice, "Miss, please come back with me." After saying that, he reached out to grab her wrist. Alice did not expect him to use force. She screamed angrily, "What do you want to do? Bastard, get out of my way!" The 2 knights around him immediately moved to stop the middle-aged officer. One of them grabbed the middle-aged officer's wrist. The strong force made the middle-aged officer feel a little pain. He could not help but look angrily at the 2 cold-faced knights. "Do you want to die? If anything happens to Miss Alice, you will all die." The 2 knights only stared at him coldly, as if they did not hear him. The middle-aged officer was furious. At this time, the crowd in front of them suddenly pushed forward. The 2 knights and the middle-aged officer were caught off guard and lost their footing. When the middle-aged officer came to his senses, he suddenly saw that Alice, who had been protected by the 2 knights, had disappeared. He was so shocked that his face turned pale. Cold sweat broke out all over his body. He shouted in panic, "Miss Alice, Miss Alice!" Screams of fear sounded from the crowd, drowning out his voice. Roar! The roar echoed from the back of the crowd. The few figures that were chasing from the street had rushed into the square. The few soldiers who were blocking the way were no match for them. They had already fallen into a pool of blood. The nearby civilians who saw the bloody scene immediately lost confidence in the army. They fled in panic. They desperately pushed and pushed the crowd. The entire square shook like waves. More and more undeads ran from the back of the street as screams echoed. They rushed towards the crowd and the soldiers who were guarding outside the crowd. The square immediately fell into chaos. Dean frowned as he saw the changes. He thought that it was stupid to gather so many people together. It was simply a beacon for the undeads. It was hard not to be attracted. He turned and walked to the other side. He had no intention to make a move. The screams from the direction of the square were getting louder and louder as he left. There were some desperate cries. He followed the route to the Monster Research Institute. Suddenly he saw a figure jump out from a side alley. It was the girl that the middle-aged officer wanted to protect, Alice. Alice ran out of the trail and almost bumped into Dean. She looked at Dean, who stopped at the exit of the trail. "What are you looking at? Haven't you seen a beautiful woman like me? Be careful or I'll dig out your eyes." Dean glanced at her indifferently. He took Aisha's hand and continued to move forward. Alice looked left and right. She found that her two attendants didn't come out from the square. The screams from there made her feel a trace of fear. She didn't dare to approach. Her eyes swept around and fell on Dean again. She rushed forward and shouted, "Hey, look at your clothes. You should have some skills. Now go and find a carriage for me. Take me to Christine." Dean continued to lead Aisha straight away as if he didn't hear her. Alice did not expect that she would actually be ignored. She was infuriated and shouted, "Stinking lowly commoner, stop right there. I'm a noble. Do you want to die? How dare you treat me like this?" Dean didn't look back. "Get out of here." Alice was stunned. She gritted her teeth and chased after Dean. She pulled Dean's armor. "Apologize to me or I'll turn you into a dog slave and sell you to the nobles. You'll be better off dead than alive." Dean slapped her in the face. Her body staggered a few steps and fell to the ground. "Stupid!" Dean glanced at her coldly and strode forward. Alice covered her burning cheeks and sat on the ground in a daze. Her brain could not react for a moment. She had actually been beaten, and by a black-haired commoner at that. Her eyes showed strong resentment as she saw Dean was about to go out of the street. She climbed up from the ground and chased after him. As soon as she rushed out of the street, she saw a few staggering figures walking on the side of the street. She knew that these people were infected by the undead plague and were very dangerous. But at this moment she didn't care anymore. She waved to the few staggering figures and shouted, "Come, come!" A few undeads heard the voice and immediately turned to look at her. Their eyes emitted green light and locked on Alice's figure. They quickly rushed over. Dean was slightly startled to see that the girl was actually courting death. But the next moment, his eyes turned cold. He saw that the girl waited for a few undeads to run close. She turned and pointed to Dean, who was walking to another street, and shouted, "Help me kill him! Kill him!" Roar. A few undeads couldn't understand her words. They roared and showed their fangs. Their mouths cracked from ear to ear, and they ferociously rushed to her. Alice was shocked to see such a ferocious appearance. But the next moment she reacted. Her face turned pale and her body trembled. She trembled and said, What do you want to do?" "I asked you to kill him." "No." Before she finished her words, she was thrown down by an undead and bitten on the shoulder. The rest of the walking corpses quickly followed, pressing Alice's body to the ground and biting desperately. "No, it hurts. I'm a noble. Do you want to die?" Accompanied by the screams of horror and despair, the voice soon stopped. Apparently, the undeads had bitten off her throat. Chapter 691. The doors of the houses on the street were closed. There was no living person in most of the buildings on the street. Most of them had been evacuated. In addition to the previous army in the square, Dean didn't see any more troops or knight. The streets were dilapidated and deserted. Only the walking dead were wandering. In just a day and a night, the bustling city had become like a ghost town. Half an hour later, Dean finally came to the edge of the Monster Research Institute on the map. This was the largest monster research institute in Carmen City. It was backed by a high mountain and on the left by a river. It was surrounded by forests and rolling hills. It was extremely remote. As Dean walked through the forest, he met 2 or 3 small monsters and killed them. Although they were small monsters, they were also ferocious beasts that had been irradiated. Most ordinary people would die if they encountered them. Obviously, no one was willing to come close to the forest where these small monsters appeared. Dean was standing behind a tree. There was a green snake hanging on the branch of his neck, but its head was broken and badly mutilated. Using the cover of the trees, Dean looked at the open space in front of him. The terrain was relatively low-lying, and there was a low building. It was inconspicuous. Unlike the aristocratic castle-style buildings, this building tended to be modern concrete industrial buildings. The moonlight fell on the building, which was a bit cold. Through the heat source reaction captured by vision, Dean found that there were a lot of human activities under the building. The heat source reaction of these people was similar to ordinary soldiers, but slightly stronger than ordinary civilians. In the depths of the building, there were also some strange heat sources. They were probably captured monsters. The Underground Research Institute is a bit similar to the Scientific Research Institute of the old era. Dean's eyes flashed slightly. As he had guessed, there was no outbreak of the zombie plague in this Monster Research Institute. Everything was still going on in an orderly manner. It seemed that the virus outbreak outside didn't care. "Wait for me here," Dean whispered to Aisha. He decided to go alone. It wouldn't be too late to call her for help if he encountered a danger that he couldn't deal with. As long as he didn't enter a soundproof place, with Aisha's hearing, she could hear him even if he rang the bell from thousands of meters away. It was just that the reception was slower. Dean immediately converged his aura, blocked his pores, and quietly groped his way over after seeing Aisha's acquiescence. He climbed over 2 trench traps and crossed a hidden line buried in the grass. He smoothly approached the low building built on the ground. Through the heat sensor, he could see that there were 8 guards stationed in the corners of the building. They were all senior limitless level. He didn't know if there were stronger people hiding in the dark. It would be best if he could sneak in smoothly. If it really didn't work, he could only ask Hylicia to break through. His body crawled on the ground, avoiding a blind spot, and slowly approached the door. In his mind, he silently calculated the success rate of his attack. For him, killing 8 high-level limiters was not a difficult task, but it would be a little difficult to kill them without making a sound. "Have you heard? A zombie plague has broken out outside. Many cities have been sealed off. Do you think the virus was leaked from our research institute? There must be someone behind this. So many cities have a virus outbreak at the same time. It's definitely not a simple leak. It should be a force that wants to use the virus to control the cities. Isn't this a power struggle against His Majesty Aristotle? Who knows?" There were several chatting voices in the room. 3 men and 1 woman were talking. The others didn't participate in the conversation. Dean's eyes flashed. He slowly withdrew from the low building and returned to the woods outside. Then he went straight to a nearby street. He deliberately made a sound and kicked open the closed doors of the undeads along the street. He released the undeads inside and used his speed advantage to lead them all the way. Soon, dozens of undeads roared and chased after him. This scene was seen by the survivors in the houses on the street, and they were stunned. Dean quickly ran into the woods. When he was close to the Monster Research Institute, he immediately accelerated and disappeared from the undead's detection. The group of undeads continued to search for a while following his footprints, but there was still no order. They gradually returned to the state of wandering. Some of the undeads encountered the small monsters in the forest and immediately fought with them. Dean once again sneaked back to the low building and waited in a shadowy corner. It didn't take long for the 8 guards in the building to hear a ferocious roar from the forest outside and the screams of the monsters living in the forest. The chatting topic was suddenly interrupted. One of them said, "It seems that something is coming. Molly, you see what's the situation?" Another person said. The room was quiet for a few seconds. Suddenly, a woman was surprised. "Someone is lurking outside us in the west corner." Dean's face changed slightly. He didn't expect that someone inside could perceive him. He had used the surrounding environment to hide at the moment and eliminated his own heat source and smell. It was not difficult to find his trace unless it was someone who was extremely sensitive to sound. But such a person should have found him at the beginning. Although he didn't know how the woman called Molly found him, he didn't continue to hide. He jumped out of the shadows and rushed to the window. The dagger in his hand instantly fell into his palm. He rushed to kill the 2 guards by the window. Courting death. The 2 guards reacted when they heard Molly's voice. At the moment they saw the window was broken, they immediately made a move. Dean's dagger was quickly parried. The sneak attack failed. He quickly retracted his hand and shook the bell. Although he could defeat the 2 guards with his ability, it would take some time to kill them. Since he had been exposed, he had to finish the battle quickly. The bell rang. Aisha heard it in the forest. Her black eyes flashed a trace of murderous intent. She instantly rushed out. Dean's body backed out of the building at the same time as Aisha rushed out. At this moment, the 8 guards in the building had surrounded him. When Aisha moved out, one of the women screamed, "Not good! Someone is coming! So fast!" A burly young man next to her shouted, "Immediately pass the order! There is an enemy attack!" Dean saw a short young man among the 8 guards turn around and was ready to drill into the building. He immediately threw his dagger to block his way. Chapter 692. Under the command of the burly youth, the bodies of the other 7 people quickly changed. All of them entered the magic mark state without reservation. Some of them had soft tissues protruding from their backs like vines, some of them had their mouths split open, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth, and some of their pupils turned blood red. At first glance, they looked like a group of monsters in the hazy moonlight. If an ordinary person saw this scene, most of them would have fainted on the spot. Dean also did not hold back. He stimulated the power of the magic marks in his body. His whole body was covered with white bones like a human skeleton. Compared with the other people in front of him who had changed their bodies, his change was the most normal one. Whoosh! Dean did not flinch. He rushed to the short youth, who was ready to run back to the building. The burly youth roared and waved his sword at Dean. His body was covered with pale golden scales, and there were several spikes on his back, like a protruding spine. When he waved his sword, 2 black whips were shot from behind him. It was another woman's attack. A cold light flashed in Dean's eyes. His body flashed as he dodged the attack of the burly youth. At the same time, he quickly grabbed the 2 black whips. They were slippery like the tongue of a monster. He shouted in his heart. The white bones covering his palm suddenly protruded into the soft tissues of the black whips. He firmly grasped it and backhanded it. The woman who was connected to the soft tissues of the black whips groaned in pain. Her body rushed toward Dean. At the same time, the other black whips behind her were like dancing snakes, shooting toward Dean. Dean was about to make a move when a cold wind suddenly came from the side. It was another middle-aged man with a spear. The middle-aged man's magic mark state was extremely ferocious. His mouth was cracked to the ears, and his soft tongue was covered with fine teeth barbs. Once bitten, a piece of skin would be torn off. Dean did not continue to attack the woman. 2 sharp blades protruded from the white bones of his palm. He cut off the 2 soft tissues of the black whip. He turned around to avoid the middle-aged man's spear and punched the middle-aged man's face. The middle-aged man was punched. His body staggered back a few steps. A bloody hole appeared on his face. On the other hand, a sharp bone protruded from Dean's fist, dripping blood. Whoosh! A gust of cold wind suddenly pierced his face. Dean's face slightly changed, and he hurriedly tilted his head. A cold arrow brushed past his cheek, and the strong wind caused a trace of pain on his skin. He glanced around and saw that the short youth had already taken the opportunity to enter the building. His heart sank, knowing that it was impossible to stop him. It was already strenuous to fight 1 against 8, and the short youth only needed a few seconds to enter the building to report. In such a short period of time, the remaining 7 people were more than enough to stall him. Damn it! A cold glint flashed in the depths of his eyes. The dragon blood art in his body was suddenly activated, causing all the blood in his body to boil. With a quick stride, he pounced on a young man who was trying to flank him from the left. The youth quickly raised his weapon to block, but Dean's body flashed, and he suddenly rushed back to the middle-aged man who was ready to support him, and punched him in the face. The middle-aged man was caught off guard, but his reaction was extremely fast. He was so frightened that he hastily retreated, his face pale. He tilted his neck back to avoid Dean's fist, but the next moment, his eyes suddenly widened. On his throat, a blood splashed, cutting the larynx and artery. An extremely slender spike protruded from Dean's fist. Seeing that the attack was successful, he immediately pounced on him, ready to pursue and kill him. "You're courting death!" Seeing that Dean ignored him, the burly youth roared and rushed over with his sword. His momentum was fierce, and his whole body was full of flaws. He did not consider defense at all. Looking at his desperate attack, Dean had to stop. He lowered his body and dodged the sharp knife. He punched the man's chest. The spikes on the back of his fist hit the man's chest. He felt as if he had hit an iron wall. There was a kind of pain, but the spikes on his fist still broke the tough thing and pierced into the man's chest. The burly youth waved his sword and slashed down angrily, avoiding Dean. Looking down, he saw a hole in the armor on his chest, from which blood was seeping out. He was shocked and angry, but there was some fear in his eyes. His magic mark was the magic mark of the rare monster Steel Dragon. With this armor, it was almost difficult for people of the same rank to hurt him, but Dean's attack was beyond his imagination. "White bones, what kind of magic mark is this? Who is this person?" The burly youth looked at Dean, who was surrounded by 4 people but still stubbornly resisted. His face was ugly. Judging from the opponent's attack, he was not a pioneer, but his movement was ingenious, his attack was sharp, and the defense of the white bones was not inferior to his. Even if he was accidentally stabbed, he was not injured, but only suffered some impact force. "Molly, use your poison gas!" The burly youth turned and shouted. The woman who was standing at the back hesitated for a moment, but she still quickly gathered her strength. Her body changed the least among the 8 people, but if the moonlight was bright enough, one could see that her skin had turned green, and her face was covered with strange patterns. These patterns looked like the patterns of trees, but they also looked like poisonous pythons coiling around her body. The degree of horror was no less than that of the others. She slightly inhaled, and her originally plump chest swelled at the moment, like a bullfrog. Just as she was about to open her mouth, suddenly a black shadow flashed in front of her eyes. Her pupils shrank, and before she had time to see clearly, she felt black in front of her eyes, and completely lost consciousness. Puff! Aisha's sharp fingers pierced straight from Jasmine's forehead to her brain. She was like an unrestrained beast. She roared ferociously as her fingers exerted force and crushed Jasmine's entire skull in an instant. Molly's body twitched and fell down, and blood flowed from her head. As Aisha retracted her hand, her skull, scalp, and hair were all lifted off, and only the bloody brain was gurgling out. The burly youth standing not far away saw this scene, and his face was full of horror, and he exclaimed, "Stop!" Aisha was about to pounce on Jasmine's body when she heard the voice of the burly young man behind her. She turned back abruptly. The veil covering her cheeks had been blown away by the wind due to her extreme speed, revealing a peerless face. But at this moment, the expression on her face was extremely ferocious. Her pure black eyes were like black holes that exuded endless evil, swallowing all life. The burly youth was shocked when he saw her face, and his heartbeat seemed to stop. Roar! Aisha let out a low roar and suddenly pounced over. As fast as a phantom, the burly youth almost had no time to react, and his body was pushed to the ground. His head hit the ground heavily, and the grass splashed. The next moment, a sharp pain came from his neck. When the burly youth came back to his senses, a large piece of flesh and blood had been torn off his neck. When Aisha was ready to eat again, a roar came from the side. She saw the woman with the mutated soft tissue black whip on her back was angry, and controlled the soft tissue black whip on her back to stab Aisha's back like a black arrow. Aisha bared her teeth, jumped up from the burly youth, and went straight to the woman. The soft tissue black whip controlled by the woman hit Aisha's body, but it didn't cause any damage, just shredded the clothes on her shoulder. Aisha, like an angry beast, pounced straight in front of the woman, pressed her to the ground, and opened her mouth to bite the woman's face, and soon a large piece of flesh and blood was bitten off. The people besieging Dean noticed the change behind them, and for a moment they were a little confused. Dean took advantage of the middle-aged man's distraction, and suddenly rushed over. He quickly reached out and pressed on the middle-aged man's hand that was holding the gun. The white bone covered the palm of the middle-aged man's hand protruded out of the sharp thorn, and the pain made the middle-aged man scream. His palm instinctively loosened a bit, and he wanted to withdraw his hand. Dean took advantage of the opportunity, and his knee hit the shaft of the spear, and twisted the back of the middle-aged man's hand upward. Puff! The spear stabbed from the bottom up, and penetrated the middle-aged man's chin. The others didn't expect to lose another companion in the blink of an eye. They were shocked and angry, and attacked Dean fiercely. Dean immediately retreated, and dodged left and right in the encirclement of the three people. After Aisha bit the soft-tissue black whipwoman to death, she was immediately attracted by the three people besieging Dean. She roared and quickly rushed over. One of them was caught off guard by Aisha from behind, and his neck was bitten. He screamed and backhanded, trying to break away from Aisha. But Aisha's teeth were not inferior to flesh, and after biting and tearing, a large piece of flesh and blood fell. This brutal scene made the remaining two people timid. Dean took advantage of their slow attack speed, and suddenly rushed forward to fight with one of them. The other person wanted to rush to support, but saw his companion next to him was bitten by Aisha, and couldn't help but pale with fear. In less than a second of hesitation, he immediately turned around and ran back to the building. In a one-on-one situation, Dean quickly held down the young man and killed him. At this time, the advantage of his magic mark ability was reflected. He could both attack and defend, and in a group fight with equal physique, he was not weak at all. Dean looked at the appearance of Aisha lying on the corpse, and quickly pulled her away. He shook the bell to control her, and then rushed into the building with her. Through the visual heat source capture, he had already seen that the short young man who drilled into the building and the previous person who escaped had rushed to the basement under the building. At the moment, the staff in the basement were constantly going deeper into the ground. Apparently, they had received the alarm notice. Dean's eyes swept, and soon found a floor that was not closed. Below it was a staircase. It was estimated that the last person who escaped was in a hurry and forgot to close the passage. He immediately took Aisha down the stairs, and soon came to a brightly lit passage. This was already the first underground floor. According to the heat source he had captured before, this underground building had a total of 8 floors. Because of the distance on the 8th floor, the heat source was very faint and blurred, and it was difficult to see a human figure. He was not sure whether there was a 9th floor or a deeper level. The walls of the first floor were all khaki, and with the dim light of the oil lamp it was a bit like a secret room. He walked along the corridor, and along the way, he kicked open some doors. These rooms had long been empty, but there were various rooms similar to hospital operating rooms. Some rooms had shelves full of strange bottles and jars, and some bottles and jars were sealed with children's palms. Among them, there was the head of a newborn baby, whose eyes didn't seem to open, and whose eyelids were almost transparent. In addition to human tissues, Dean also saw many strange monster tissues. There were fist-sized eyeballs, and cute little claws like a tiger's. It looked like some evil alchemist's experiment room in the outer wall area. Dean walked along the passage to the end, and there was a staircase. He went to the second underground floor. He kicked open the doors along the way. In one of the rooms that looked like an operating room, there was a woman with disheveled hair tied to a metal table. She was completely naked, but the most shocking thing was that the skin on her chest from her shoulder to her abdomen was gone. It was a bloody mess, and there were some black tubes inserted into it, guiding the liquid from a blood-red glass jar next to the table. Dean wrinkled his brows. Most likely, this woman was captured by the Monster Research Institute as experimental material. Aisha's nose twitched as she smelled the blood, and showed a trace of ferocity. Dean twisted the handle of the door and threw it through the woman's head. Then he took Aisha and left. Death might be the best result for this woman. Even if she was released, it would be difficult for her to survive with her body that had been experimented on. Dean didn't look at the other rooms. He stamped his feet and jumped to the third floor of the basement. There were several weak heat sources in the rooms of the third underground floor. The situation was similar to the woman upstairs. Two of the heat sources were big and small. The big one was the size of an elephant, and the small one was the size of a puppy. The shape was not human. Most likely it was a monster being experimented on. Dean continued to stomp the floor, and fell to the fifth underground floor. He looked down. At the moment, there were many people on the sixth floor who were preparing to retreat. They were moving in a hurry. He lifted his foot and broke through the ground and fell to the sixth underground floor. A middle-aged man in a white coat rushed in front of him. He was shocked by the sudden fall of Dean and fell to the ground with a pale face. Dean glanced at the man's clothes. There was a work card on his chest, and the name and position were written on it. Head of the Ministry of Health? He slightly raised his eyebrows and went in front of the middle-aged man. What is your position, doctor? The middle-aged man looked at Dean, and then looked at Aisha next to him. Compared to Dean, Aisha's appearance was more frightening. Her face was stained with blood, and her hands were red. He swallowed his throat and stuttered. I'm just in charge of sanitation, I don't know anything. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.